At the time that this happened, my family lived in an old 2-story house at the edge of a half-abandoned industrial district. There were warehouses and empty lots behind the neighborhood, and after dark the whole area became strangely quiet. My parents, they both worked evening shifts, so there were plenty of nights when I was the only person in the house for hours. The house itself was nothing special too. My bedroom was at the end of a hallway, directly above the living room. One evening I was lying on my bed watching videos with the door partly open. It was sometime after midnight, I think, when I heard someone coming up the staircase. Slow footsteps, not hurried and not sneaking, but just the unmistakable sound of someone putting their weight onto each step. I assumed that one of my parents had gotten home early. The footsteps, they reached the upstairs landing and continued down the hallway. Then I heard what sounded like my father's voice. "Are you still awake?" I remember answering yes. There was no response. A few seconds later, I heard the bathroom door open and the faucet. Water ran for several seconds before stopping, and at that point I was actually sort of relieved. I figured that my dad had come home and gone straight to the bathroom without bothering to answer me, and I got out of bed and stepped into the hallway. The bathroom light was on, and the door was almost completely closed. "Dad?" Nothing. I walked over and pushed the door open, but nobody was inside. The sink was also completely dry. I stood there for several seconds trying to understand what I was looking at. Then I heard something downstairs, like furniture being dragged across the floor. I looked over the railing toward the staircase. The downstairs hallway was dark except for the weak light coming from the kitchen. And standing just beyond that light was something that I still don't know how to describe exactly. At first I thought it was a person standing with their back toward me, but then it moved, and it wasn't quite shaped like a person. It looked almost like a vertical patch of darkness, taller than I was, with edges that seemed to blur into the room around it. There were no visible clothes, no facial features, hands, or even clear legs. But whatever it was simply there. Also, I couldn't see its face because there didn't seem to be one. I froze seeing it. The thing remained eerily motionless too, like a statue, for maybe 3 or 4 seconds. Then it started moving toward the staircase. It didn't climb and it didn't walk. The entire shape simply glided forward. And well, that was enough for me. I ran back into my bedroom, slammed the door and locked it. I remember sitting on the floor beside my bed with my knees pulled against my chest, and for a while there was nothing. Then I heard footsteps outside of my room, except they weren't the same footsteps that I'd heard earlier. These were way quieter, slow and meticulous, one step after another. They stopped directly outside of my door as well, and I watched that doorknob move. It began turning slowly, but thank God that lock held. The handle stopped, and then came 3 knocks. Not on the door though, which was odd, but on the wall beside it. 3 sharp knocks. I could actually feel the vibration through the walls as well, which is weird, but I didn't move. A few seconds later, there were 3 more, and then after that, nothing. I stayed there, though, exactly in that spot, until my parents eventually came home. They found me sitting on the floor beside my bed, and I never actually told them what happened. I couldn't figure out how to explain hearing one of them coming through the house when clearly neither of them had been there. The bathroom had been empty, the downstairs was undisturbed, and there was no obvious source for the sounds. For years afterward, too, I would automatically look down a hallway before turning off a light after that every single time. Even now, if I'm somewhere unfamiliar and I hear footsteps approaching from another room, I get that same panic and tingling that I had sitting on my bedroom floor that night. There are some places where you eventually get used to being alone at night. A mortuary isn't one of them, at least not completely. I worked overnight at a funeral home for quite a few years actually, mostly doing preparation work, but after enough time the job becomes routine. You stop thinking about what the bodies were like when they were alive and start thinking about the work in front of you. You have to compartmentalize it or every shift would just get inside of your head. The building that I was working in at the time was pretty old too. It had originally been a small medical facility before being converted into a funeral home, and parts of it still looked like they belonged to a hospital, in fact. The basement preparation area was especially unpleasant. Concrete floors, exposed pipes, fluorescent lights, and a ventilation system that always seemed to make some kind of a noise. Well, this happened during a particularly cold spell in February. I'd finished my work for the night and was cleaning up before moving everything back into storage. There was nobody else downstairs, the other staff had already gone upstairs, and I was expecting to be finished within another 15 minutes or so. I remember rinsing some instruments when I heard something behind me. It sounded like a metal tray being dropped. I turned around expecting to see something on the floor, but nothing was there. A few seconds later, I noticed that one of the instrument trays on the counter had actually moved. Not fallen, but moved. It was now sitting several inches away from where I'd left it. I stared at it for a while, though, because, there was no obvious reason for how it had moved. The counter was level, nothing had been placed against it, and there wasn't enough vibration from the building to explain what I'd seen. Believe it or not, I actually laughed at it. I remember saying something along the lines of, "Okay, very funny," even though nobody was there. Then, the room suddenly became extremely cold. The heating had been unreliable for years, so initially I assumed that it was just the building. But this felt different. The temperature seemed to drop almost instantly, in fact. I could even see my breath. Then I got this incredibly strange sensation across my arms and neck, and it wasn't exactly fear. It was more like every nerve in my body just suddenly switched on at the same time. My skin prickled, and the hair on my arms stood up, and I had this overwhelming impression that something was standing directly behind me. I didn't turn around. I don't know why, but I just stood there staring at the counter. Then something happened that I still could not properly explain. It genuinely felt like I was shoved. Not hard enough to knock me over, but hard enough that I stumbled several feet forward toward the doorway. There was nobody behind me, but I spun around immediately anyway, and the room was empty. I looked under the tables, behind the storage cabinets, and even checked the adjoining room, but there was no one there. At that point, I decided that I was done for the night. I left everything exactly where it was, went upstairs, grabbed my things, and I just got into my car. I sat there for several minutes before driving away because my hands were shaking so badly. Badly enough, in fact, that I didn't trust myself to put the key in the ignition, let alone drive. For the next several days, though, I came up with every possible explanation that I could. Maybe I was exhausted. Maybe something had malfunctioned with the heating system. Maybe there had been pressure for the door opening somewhere in the building. Maybe I'd simply startled myself and convinced my body that I'd been pushed. Eventually, though, I just went back to work. Nothing else happened, too. For a while, I actually thought that would be the end of it. But a few years later, I was working for another funeral home. The building was newer, but the owners had decorated it in a very sort of old-fashioned-y sort of style. One of the corridors connecting the preparation rooms to the staff area had several large antique mirrors mounted along the walls, and I hated those mirrors. Not because anything had happened with them, but they just made the hallway feel longer than it actually was, especially at night when most of the lights were switched off, and it was creepy. Anyway, one evening I was walking down the corridor after making some coffee, and I was alone. There was a mirror at the end of the hallway, and I happened to glance into it as I walked by. And that is when I noticed somebody behind me. At first I assumed it was another employee, as you do, right? But there was a dark shape standing near the doorway at the end of the corridor, and I stopped. The shape stopped too. I remember thinking that the person was wearing one of those long protective garments that we used in the preparation room. I started to turn around, then I stopped myself. Something about the reflection was wrong. The figure wasn't positioned correctly. It looked as though it was standing behind me, but the angle just didn't make any sense. So instead of turning around, I kept watching the mirror. The figure slowly moved closer, and I couldn't make out a face. It was just a dark, indistinct shape where a person's head should have been, but then it tilted its head, and I tilted mine without thinking. The figure did the same thing, and that's when I realized that it wasn't simply standing there. It was copying me. I straightened up, and it straightened up. I took one small step backward, and it took one too. I don't remember making a conscious decision to run, but one second I was standing there, and the next I was sprinting down that hallway. I didn't look behind me. I pushed the doors, crossed the lobby, and I ran outside. I could hear my footsteps behind me, but there was something else mixed with them too, a breathing sound. At first I thought it was mine, genuinely, but then I realized it just wasn't quite right. It sounded like my breathing, but distorted in a weird way, slower and deeper, with the same rhythm but not the same sound. I stopped near my car and the sound stopped. I looked back toward the building, but nothing was standing in the doorway. I waited for somebody to come outside, but nobody ever did, so I stayed beside my car for a long time before finally going home. The next day, I asked one of my co-workers whether anyone had actually been in that hallway after me, and as far as they knew, nobody had. I obviously didn't tell them what I'd seen. I couldn't bring myself to explain it without sounding completely insane. So I continued working there for quite a while afterward, actually, but I certainly changed one habit. From that day on, I stopped looking into those mirrors. If I had to walk down that corridor at night, I'd look at the floor or straight ahead, and I never gave the reflections more than a passing glance. I've spent years working around death, and I've seen enough strange things that I don't automatically assume that every unexplained event is supernatural for sure, but I mean, maybe the first incident was a building problem, maybe I was exhausted, maybe the second one was some trick of the light and my brain filled in the rest. I genuinely and honestly don't know for sure, but what bothers me is that both experiences happened when I was completely alone, and either felt like an ordinary mistake in the moment. The first time, I definitely felt something move me. The second time, I watched something in the mirror react to me. I still work around the dead, but I learned something from those experiences. Being comfortable around death doesn't mean you're comfortable with everything that might be waiting in the dark. And if I'm walking through an empty building at night and passing a mirror, I still make a point of looking anywhere, and I mean anywhere, except into that glass. I used to think that if a house was new enough, there couldn't possibly be anything wrong with it. No history, no previous owners, no abandoned rooms or decades of strange stories. Just fresh timber, new carpet and walls that had never had enough time to become creepy. Well, I don't really believe that anymore. You see, a few years ago, I was looking after a little boy for a family that I knew. They'd recently moved into a new development on the edge of town, and the whole neighborhood looked like it had been just sort of dropped onto an empty field overnight. Every house was nearly identical. The gardens were still mostly dirt, and the trees were so young that they barely provided any shade. The parents were going to be gone until the following afternoon, so I'd agreed to stay overnight. Their son was 2 at the time, and usually pretty easy to look after. He ate dinner without a fight, played with his toys for a while, and basically just went upstairs without making much of a fuss. Nothing about the evening felt strange at all. Now, around 9 though, his behavior just sort of changed. He was beside his bed when I went to check on him, and he wasn't crying or upset. He was just sort of staring toward the corner of the ceiling. I asked him what he was looking at. He didn't answer. I asked again, and after a few seconds, he pointed upward. I assumed he meant something on the ceiling, and I looked, and there was nothing. I checked the light fixture, the smoke detector, and even the corner where the walls met the ceiling, but as far as I could tell, there was nothing there. I then asked him what he was pointing at, as best as I could for a 2-year-old, and he just kept pointing. That was about as much as I could get out of him, and I'd figured that he'd seen a shadow or had a bad dream or something. Kids that age can turn a coat hanging on a chair into a monster, so I wasn't particularly concerned. Anyway, I got him settled back into bed, and eventually I went downstairs, and for the next couple of hours everything was pretty normal. But then I heard something upstairs. It wasn't a bang or a crash or anything, it was more of a repetitive sound. Something like a heavy object being moved a short distance, stopping and then being dragged again. It was coming from the main bedroom. I remember turning the television off because I wanted to be certain that I wasn't imagining it, and the sound continued. I checked the security cameras on my phone. The front of the house was empty, nothing was in the driveway, and the backyard looked completely normal. I called upstairs, but there was no answer. The dragging started again, though. At that point, I was more annoyed than frightened. I assumed that something had fallen over or something like that, so I went upstairs and the hallway was completely silent. I opened the bedroom door. A small table near the window had been knocked over. One of the decorative objects sitting on it was laying several feet away, too. What bothered me about this was that it wasn't simply on the floor beneath the table. It had landed almost against the opposite wall. I stood there, staring at it, and then I heard that dragging sound again. This time it came from directly behind me, though. I turned around instantly, but I couldn't see anything. I checked the other rooms upstairs and found no obvious explanation. The little boy was still asleep, and I went back downstairs and sat on the sofa, but I just couldn't relax anymore. About 20 minutes later, I heard the noise again. Then something hit the floor hard enough that the sound literally traveled through the ceiling. The boy woke up crying this time. I ran upstairs, picked him up, and carried him downstairs. He was sort of still half asleep and a bit groggy, but he immediately pointed toward the staircase. Well, that was enough for me. I didn't want to frighten him by telling him that I was scared, so I grabbed my coat, took him outside, and put him into my car. We sat there with the doors locked for the rest of the night pretty much, and honestly, I felt kind of ridiculous. I mean, the house was practically brand new. It had modern locks, security cameras, bright outdoor lighting, and none of the usual things you associate with supposedly haunted houses. Yet I couldn't make myself go back inside after this. The parents eventually came home the next morning, and I told them what happened, although I sort of left out some of the details because I was a bit embarrassed. They assumed that I had heard something settling in the walls, or maybe a piece of furniture had shifted, and I didn't argue with that. I didn't want to sound like I'd convinced myself that the house was haunted after one strange night. Well, a few weeks later, I happened to run into the father while I was out shopping, and he looked absolutely exhausted. We talked for a few minutes, and then he asked whether I had mentioned anything unusual about the night that I babysat, and I told him that I had. He went quiet, and he told me that they'd recently been doing some work underneath the house. Apparently the builders had found a sealed-off section beneath a part of the property or something that hadn't been shown on the original plans. It wasn't a basement. It was more like an old foundation or a storage area that had been buried when the development was constructed. And inside were several personal belongings, apparently belonging to someone. Old photographs, letters, pieces of jewelry, some children's things, I think. Nothing immediately explained why they were there, but the developers had apparently known that an older property had once occupied a part of that land, but the family had been completely unaware that anything had remained underneath their house. Eventually, they threw most of that stuff away, and I asked him whether they'd found anything dangerous, and he said no, and he added something that I still remember. Since we found it, my wife doesn't like being upstairs at night. I asked why. He said that the same bedroom where I'd heard the noise had started making strange sounds. Not constantly, but just occasionally. Footsteps, movement, things being knocked over. He tried to find a normal explanation for everything, but eventually stopped trying. I asked him whether his son had said anything or pointed at anything, and he looked at me for a few seconds before answering. He's apparently been talking about a woman, or saying a woman or lady, and that was probably the part that stayed with me the most. I never went back into that house, and what bothers me is that the house was just so new, like I mentioned. There was no century-old staircases, no abandoned room, no previous family whose history everybody whispered about. As far as I know, the house had barely existed for maybe a year. And yet, that little boy had been staring at something in his bedroom before I'd heard anything myself. I've looked after children plenty of times since then, and whenever one of them suddenly stops what they're doing and starts staring at the empty part of the room or something like that, I don't automatically assume that they're just imagining something there anymore. Sometimes I'll look too, and obviously I don't expect to see anything, but still, these days, I always check anyway. I've always been the kind of person who needs to understand how things work before I get comfortable with them. If something falls, there's a reason. If a door opens, there's a draft or somebody pushed it. If something moves across a room, well, there has to be something causing it. That's probably why this bothered me as much as it did, really. At the time, I was doing temporary contract work for a company that rented part of an older commercial building outside of Milwaukee. My job was mostly data entry and inventory paperwork, so there wasn't really anything particularly interesting about the work itself. The building was one of those places that had been renovated several times without ever really being modernized. The outside looked fairly ordinary, but inside there were long corridors and exposed pipes and different sections that clearly belonged to different decades. My shift started early. Usually there were a few other people arriving around the same time as me, but one particular morning I got there before everybody else. It was still dark outside, and the parking lot was mostly empty. I remember thinking how quiet the building was, too. I made some coffee in the staff kitchen, and I went back toward my desk, and on the way I noticed a small plastic storage box sitting in the middle of the corridor. It was one of those clear containers that people use to organize office supplies. I assumed that somebody had left it there while moving things around, so I stepped around it and I just kept walking. Maybe 30 seconds later, I heard a sort of faint scraping sound behind me. I turned around and the box, it was moving. At first, I honestly thought that somebody was pushing it from the other side, but I confirmed that there was nobody there. It moved about a foot, stopped, and then moved again. I stood there trying to figure out what I was looking at. The hallway floor was carpeted, so it wasn't like sliding particularly easily, too. There wasn't an obvious slope anywhere. I'd walked that corridor hundreds of times. And then the box literally changed direction, too. It turned slightly and began moving toward me. That was the point where my brain started throwing explanations at me. Maybe there was something caught underneath it. Maybe the building was vibrating. Maybe there was a string attached to it or something. I actually walked toward the box because I wanted to find out whatever was causing it. Like I said, this is just how I am. But as soon as I got within a few feet, it stopped, and I stopped too. For several seconds, neither of us moved. I know how ridiculous that sounds, but that's genuinely how it felt. Then, the lid literally popped open, It didn't fly off dramatically or anything, it simply lifted several inches and dropped back into place. Upon seeing that, I took a step backward. The box moved forward. I stepped back again, and it moved again. That was when I stopped trying to explain it. I turned around and walked quickly back toward the main entrance. I didn't run because I was sort of embarrassed about the possibility of somebody seeing me sprinting through an office over a plastic container, but I was moving quickly enough that I nearly walked straight into the security desk. I told the guard there that I thought that something had fallen over in one of the corridors, and he went to go and check. I waited near the entrance, and after a few minutes he came back carrying that box. He asked if it was the thing that I was talking about, and I said yes. He laughed and told me that someone had probably left it in the hallway while cleaning, and I didn't argue. I went back to my desk, and honestly, I just tried to forget about it. For the rest of the morning, nothing else happened too. But then, shortly before lunch, one of my co-workers mentioned something that made the whole thing a lot worse. So, apparently that corridor had been part of a restricted office area years earlier. Before the renovation, there had been a supervisor's office at the end of it. The supervisor had died unexpectedly while still working there. I asked what that had to do with anything, and my co-worker sort of shrugged and said that people used to joke that the old manager still checked up on everyone. I didn't think much of it, until I noticed something about that box. So, the security guard had placed it on a shelf beside the front desk, and I could see it from where I was sitting, and every time I looked toward it, I had that strange feeling that it was facing me. I mean, of course it wasn't. It was just a transparent plastic box. There was no face, no eyes, and nothing remotely human about it. But still, I couldn't stop thinking about the way that it had moved toward me earlier. That afternoon, I asked another employee whether anyone had been in the corridor before I arrived, and he said no. I asked whether the building had any automated cleaning equipment, and again, no. I even went back to the hallway during my lunch break and looked at the carpet for anything that could have caused the movement, but there was nothing. I never experienced anything that obvious there again. A few weeks later, I found out the company was moving offices in the end, so my contract ended shortly afterward, and I've tried to convince myself that there was a completely ordinary explanation for what had occurred. But the problem that I'm having is that none of those explanations account for the part that bothers me the most. It didn't just move, it seemed to react to me. When I approached it, it stopped, and when I walked away, it followed. That could all be something I just cannot explain, obviously, but I've spent enough time around machinery, offices, and warehouses to know that objects don't behave like that normally, right? Objects don't usually wait for you to move before deciding where they're going next. And I still think about that a lot. I've worked in plenty of old offices since then, and I haven't had any other strange things happen. But after that experience, I'm certainly a lot more open to, well, alternatives. I don't really know what I'm hoping to get out of writing this down. I don't expect anyone to have any answers, and honestly, I'm not even sure I believe my own explanation of what happened. I just know that I've carried this around for years, and every so often I remember one particular night and get that same feeling that I had back then. I was 23 when this happened. I'd gone to Japan for a university placement, and had ended up spending several months in a small mountain community. It wasn't somewhere tourists usually went. There were a few villages spread along the valley, a handful of farms, and long stretches of forest between them. My placement was with an agricultural research group, and because I was only there temporarily, they found me a cheap place to stay. It was a small house on the edge of one of those villages, and the house wasn't ancient or traditional Japanese architecture or anything. That was actually part of why I accepted it in the end. It was a fairly ordinary timber house from the late 20th century, with sliding doors, a little kitchen, and a separate bedroom that had apparently been added during a renovation at some point. But the rent was almost absurdly cheap. At the time, I assumed that was because the house was so far from everything, and for the first month I absolutely loved it. There was almost no traffic at night. I could hear insects through the open windows, rain on the roof, and occasionally someone driving down the road in the distance, but that was about it. My nearest neighbor was far enough away that I could barely see their house through the trees. I was spending most of my time studying anyway, so the isolation really suited me at the time. The first strange thing happened in the kitchen, though. I was making coffee one morning, and I looked toward the doorway, and for maybe a second, the room looked completely different. I don't mean that something appeared in it. The actual layout was just wrong. The refrigerator seemed to be where the doorway was. The kitchen counter appeared to run along the opposite wall. The window was in the wrong position. It was so brief that I thought that I'd simply looked away and sort of confused myself. I blinked and everything was normal. I actually laughed at myself and blamed the lack of sleep in the end. But a few days later, it happened again. This time I was sitting at my desk when I looked up and suddenly had the unmistakable impression that the room had been completely rearranged. The ceiling seemed lower, the door was on the wrong side, even the position of the furniture looked slightly different. Then it snapped back all of a sudden. I started paying more attention after that. It never lasted more than a second or two, but I couldn't trigger it, and it didn't happen every day. Sometimes weeks would pass without anything unusual. But then I began finding objects in strange places too. The first was a teaspoon. I woke up one morning and found it on the floor beside my bed. I assumed that I'd knocked it off the bedside table at some point. The next morning there was a pen in almost exactly the same place, and I moved it back to my desk. The following morning my television remote was sitting on the floor, and I started wondering if I was doing it myself while sleepwalking or half asleep or something. Then I noticed the objects weren't randomly positioned. They were being arranged. The spoon, the pen, the remote had all been placed at different points around the center of the room, almost as if someone had been trying to mark out a shape. I didn't really think too much of it until I found 3 objects arranged in a near-perfect triangle. I took a photograph because I wanted to see whether I was imagining the precision, but after I started putting everything away before going to bed, it didn't matter anymore. The objects, they would still be on the floor in the morning. Sometimes there were things that I had definitely put somewhere else. Other times I couldn't remember moving them at all. The bedroom itself was also noticeably colder than the rest of the house, and that part had an ordinary explanation, right? At least initially. The room was an extension that had been added later, and the insulation wasn't particularly good. But even during warm weather, it would feel freezing in there. I started sleeping with an extra blanket. But then, one night I woke up because I genuinely thought that someone had entered the room. I was lying on my side facing the wall, and at first I didn't hear anything, but then I felt this vibration. It was extremely subtle, almost like the air itself was humming, and I sat up and the room was completely dark, except for a faint line of light coming from the wall beside the bed. And my first thought was that something outside was shining through a gap. So I got out of bed and I moved closer. But the line wasn't coming from a gap in the plaster. It seemed to be sort of underneath it. It ran vertically for maybe half a meter and pulsed faintly, becoming brighter and then dimmer at regular intervals. I remember touching the wall. It was freezing cold, much colder than the rest of the room. There was a slight depression in the plaster around the light, almost like there was a cavity behind it. I should have left immediately, but instead I pressed against it. The plaster gave way slightly, and not enough to break, but enough for me to realize that there really was an empty space behind that section of the wall. I pulled it away, and something moved inside. I heard a faint wooden clicking sound, then another, and I backed toward the door. The light instantly disappeared, and for a few seconds, there was nothing. Then, I heard what sounded like dozens of tiny pieces of wood knocking against one another inside of the wall. I didn't investigate any further after that. I grabbed my phone, my wallet, and the clothes closest to me, and I ran outside. I spent the rest of the night sitting in my car at the end of the road, and the next morning I contacted the person responsible for the property and told him that I needed somewhere else to stay. He didn't seem surprised, and that bothered me more than anything else, really. He told me, too, that there was an old storage cavity behind that section of the bedroom, but said that it had been sealed decades earlier, and I asked why, and he hesitated before saying that the house had been built over the remains of an old property, and apparently there had been a small religious site there before the surrounding land was redeveloped. I asked what had happened to it. He gave me a vague answer about the site being dismantled and the land being cleared or something like that. And then I asked about the bedroom, and he looked at me for a few seconds and said that the extension had been added after the original house was built. I told him about the objects appearing on the floor. He didn't laugh. Instead, he asked me whether the other objects had been arranged in circles. I remember feeling cold when he said that because I didn't mention anything about circles. I asked him what he knew, and he refused to explain any further. He simply told me that if I had already decided to leave, that I shouldn't go back into the bedroom alone to collect anything, and so I didn't. In the end, I had left most of my belongings behind, in fact. I stayed in a small apartment in the nearest city until my placement ended, and thankfully, nothing like that ever happened again while I was there. I still don't know what was inside of that wall, but I'm telling you that there was something there. I also got the distinct feeling from the landlord, too, that this was not the first time that this had happened. I spent enough years working around critically ill patients that I stopped being easily impressed by strange symptoms. There is always an explanation if you look hard enough. Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes it takes a dozen tests, and sometimes the explanation is simply that the human body can fail in ways that we don't fully understand. That mindset was pretty much essential at the time, because I was working at a small medical facility attached to a scientific station in southern Chile. It wasn't a proper hospital. We had a handful of beds, a treatment room, basic imaging equipment, and enough supplies to deal with the injuries and illnesses that were common in such an isolated place. Most of what came through the door was fairly predictable too. Falls, accidents, dehydration, infections, the occasional serious trauma. But one winter, we received a man who was a part of a field survey team, and he was somewhere in his 30s and had been found alone near an abandoned section of the research site. His co-workers said that he had been completely normal the previous evening. The next morning, they found him sitting upright against a concrete structure, unresponsive. There was no obvious injuries. His vital signs were surprisingly stable. His blood pressure was normal, his oxygen level was good, his heart rhythm looked healthy, and his temperature was unremarkable. The strange thing, though, was that we just couldn't wake him. Pain stimulus didn't work, his pupils reacted normally, his reflexes were present, he was breathing without assistance. From almost every measurable standpoint, he looked like a healthy person who was just asleep, except he wasn't sleeping. We ran everything that we could. Blood tests, neurological examinations, toxicology, scans. Nothing gave us an answer, though. The longer that he remained unconscious, if that's what you want to call it, the more uncomfortable everyone became, too. By the second night, we started rotating staff so that somebody was always watching him. And that's when the first odd thing happened. One of the nurses called me because she thought that somebody had entered the treatment room. She said that she heard the door open. I checked the corridor and I found nobody there. The door was still closed, and we assumed that she had simply heard something from another part of the building. But then it happened again and again. Over the next 2 nights, several people reported hearing the same thing, the sound of the treatment room door opening followed by footsteps approaching the patient's bed, except that nobody ever saw anyone. I wasn't particularly concerned until we discovered that the door sensor had been recording the openings too. The electrical records showed that the door had been opened at irregular intervals throughout the night, but there was just one problem. The camera covering that section of the corridor showed an empty hallway every single time. At first, we blamed the sensor, then we replaced it. The new sensor did exactly the same thing though. I still wasn't convinced that anything unusual was happening. Electronic systems malfunction, right? That was the explanation that I ran with. The patient remained unconscious, and on the third night I was sitting at the nurse's station, just doing some paperwork, when I heard a metallic noise from the treatment room. It sounded like somebody dropping a tray. I looked up, the nurse beside me heard it too. We both went inside. The patient was still lying exactly where we'd left him. Nothing had fallen. Then I noticed something on the floor beside his bed. The portable blood pressure monitor had been moved. It normally sat on the shelf near the head of the bed, but now it was several feet away, facing the patient. Nobody ever admitted to moving it too. We put it back, and about an hour later it was beside the bed again. This time it was turned on as well. The screen was displaying a blood pressure reading even though the cuff wasn't attached to anyone. The numbers weren't changing, and they were simply sitting there. I switched the machine off, but a few seconds later, it switched itself back on. That's when I started getting pretty uncomfortable. We unplugged it. It stayed off, at least for a while. The patient suddenly opened his eyes shortly after midnight, though, and everyone rushed into the room. He didn't speak. He didn't seem to recognize anyone. He just stared toward the doorway. I asked if he knew where he was, but nothing. Then he lifted one hand and pointed past me. I turned around, but there was nobody there. And when I looked back at him, he was still staring at that same spot. He whispered something, and I had to lean closer to hear it, and he said, "It's standing behind you." I immediately stepped away from the bed. I felt stupid doing it too. I was a medical professional, standing in a treatment room with an unconscious patient who had just woken up confused. I mean, there was no reason to believe anything was behind me. But still, I turned around again. Nothing. When I looked back, he closed his eyes. His heart rate had started climbing. We monitored him closely for the rest of the night. A little before dawn, the monitor suddenly began producing an irregular signal. Not an arrhythmia, but something stranger. The waveform became a series of perfectly repeating spikes, identical in height and spacing and everything. We checked the leads, we checked the cables, we replaced the monitor. The new monitor displayed exactly the same pattern though. Then, every electronic device in the room just suddenly shut down simultaneously. I mean, the lights went out, the monitors went black, the backup alarm didn't sound, and for maybe about 10 seconds, the entire room was just completely silent. Then, and it almost gave me a heart attack, the patient just sat upright. His eyes were open. He was looking directly at the empty corner beside the door, and he said very calmly, "It's leaving." The power came back, every monitor restarted, the patient collapsed backward, and he never regained consciousness, and he died later that morning. There was no obvious cause. The final paperwork listed an unexplained cardiac event, and I wish, genuinely, that that were the end of the story. But a few days later, I was reviewing the equipment records because we had to document the electrical failure and all of that, and I noticed something strange in the logs. During the 10 seconds when the equipment had supposedly been without power, one of the bedside monitors had continued recording. There was no patient waveform or anything, but instead it had captured something that looked almost like a reflection. The waveform rose and fell in a slow repeating pattern. I showed it to another clinician, and he stared at it for a long time and eventually said that it looked like somebody breathing. I told him that that was just impossible though, and he agreed, and we deleted the file. Nobody wanted to discuss it anymore, and I've thought about that patient many times since then. And look, there are plenty of ways to explain individual pieces of what happened. I get it. Faulty sensors, electrical interference, equipment malfunctions, all of that. And I can accept many of those explanations on their own. But what I cannot accept is just how several unrelated things seem to line up around the same time that the patient awoke and said that there was someone there. I mean, when you put it all together, right? The door sensors, the empty hallway, the equipment moving, the monitor operating without power, the thing that he claimed was standing right behind me. Maybe you could argue that there are some technical explanations for some of the equipment stuff, but I don't know. All of that together, it seems pretty weirdly unexplainable to me. And that's the part that has always stayed with me. Not the idea of a ghost, and not even the possibility that something supernatural was involved. It's actually the thought that there may be things happening around us that our instruments can detect without understanding, while we're standing there with all of our training, staring at numbers and assuming that if something important were happening, the chart would tell us, but we're just missing it. Sometimes I wonder whether that patient was just simply dying from a disease that we couldn't identify. Other times I remember him opening his eyes, looking at the empty space behind me and calmly telling me that whatever had been there was finally leaving. And to be quite honest, I still don't know which possibility bothers me more. I think I was probably 11 when this happened, and for years I tried to convince myself that I must have misunderstood what I had heard. My family was staying at my uncle's old property in rural Manitoba during the winter. It wasn't really a vacation. My parents were actually helping him with other work around the farm, and one evening they went over to a nearby house for a few hours while I stayed behind. The place was old enough that I was pretty used to it making noises. The heating pipes knocked, the walls creaked when the temperature dropped. Sometimes the wind would push against the windows hard enough to even make them rattle a bit. None of that bothered me though, because, I'd heard it all before. The room that I was sleeping in was at the back of the house, away from the main bedrooms. It had an old dresser, a narrow bed, and a tall wooden cupboard that had probably been there for longer than I had even. I went to sleep without thinking anything of it, and at some point during the night, I woke up. I don't remember what woke me too. There wasn't a crash or a voice or anything obvious. I just sort of opened my eyes and immediately felt like something was wrong. The room was completely dark. I lay there for a while trying to figure out whether I'd actually woken up or was still just dreaming. Then I heard something from the other side of the room. It sounded like somebody dragging their fingernails slowly across the wood. Upon hearing that, I instantly froze. The sound stopped. A few seconds later, it started again. This time it was louder, and it wasn't coming from the hallway or outside of the room or anything. It seemed to be coming from inside the wooden cupboard. I remember staring at it and thinking that there had to be an animal trapped inside. That was really the only explanation my 11-year-old brain could come up with at the time. Then, something inside of the cupboard made a noise that I still don't know how to describe. It began as a low groan and suddenly turned into what sounded like a scream. Not a normal human scream, though. It was way too harsh and distorted, almost like several different sounds happening all at once. There was a sort of tearing quality to it, as though something enormous was being pulled apart right beside me. The whole cupboard seemed to vibrate all of a sudden too. I even remember seeing the glass of water on the table beside my bed shaking. I didn't move. I didn't call for my parents. I couldn't. I was completely convinced that if I made a sound, that whatever was inside of that cupboard was about to know that I was awake and would come out and just, destroy me. The noise lasted maybe 3 or 4 seconds, and then it just stopped. And the strangest thing was that the rest of the house remained completely silent. No footsteps, no doors opening, no asking what had happened. Even the dogs outside didn't react. I lay there listening for another sound, but nothing. Eventually, I pulled the blanket over my head and I must have fallen asleep at some point because the next thing that I remember is the sunrise. I must have barely slept though because I was exhausted, and when daylight finally came through the curtains, I immediately looked at that cupboard. It looked completely normal from what I could tell. I didn't want to open it though, but eventually curiosity won, and there were some old blankets, a couple of old boxes, and a few coats hanging inside, but nothing else. No animal, no damage, no broken wood, nothing that could have produced that noise that I'd heard. I remember touching the inside of the wall of the cupboard because I thought that maybe something had fallen behind it, but there was nothing. The only unusual thing was a smell. It was faint, but it reminded me of like damp soil. I didn't tell my parents immediately. Honestly, I was pretty embarrassed by it. I also knew exactly what they were going to say. They'd probably tell me that I had a nightmare or that the old house had made some strange noise or something. But later that morning, my mother asked why I looked so exhausted, and I told her that I'd heard something during the night, and she asked me what kind of sound it was, and I tried to describe it. She sort of laughed nervously and said that the heating system probably made some weird noise because the temperature had dropped a lot. I accepted that explanation because, well, I wanted to. Years passed though, and I eventually stopped thinking about it very often. And when I was older, I asked my uncle about that cupboard, and he told me that it belonged to the previous owner, and that it had been left in the house when his family bought the property. I asked whether it had made any strange noises while he was living there, and he thought about it for a second and said that there had been one winter when they had kept hearing something scratching inside of it. I laughed because I assumed that he was joking, but he wasn't. He said that they had emptied it and checked the wall behind it because they genuinely thought that there might be mice or rats or something, but they never found anything. I didn't tell him what I heard as a kid. I'm not sure why. Maybe because I didn't want to turn one strange memory into something bigger than it was. I don't know, but what I remember most clearly isn't even the sound itself anymore. It's what happened afterward. The entire house just stayed silent. I mean, I was a child lying alone in the dark bedroom, completely convinced that something impossible had just happened a few feet away from me, and nobody else reacted. That's the part that, as always, stayed with me. So before I begin this, I just want to say that I've worked around communication equipment for long enough that, well, I've heard just about every kind of interference you can imagine. Crossed frequencies, damaged cables, electrical noises, equipment picking up signals that it shouldn't. Most of the time there's a boring explanation if you're willing to spend enough time looking for it. And that's why one night still bothers me. This was several years ago when I was doing maintenance work at a small weather monitoring station in northern Alberta. The station was a long way from the nearest town, and most shifts were pretty uneventful. We had sensors outside, a small generator building, a couple of computer terminals, and a radio system for communicating with the regional office. I was working alone overnight. It was probably around 2 in the morning when the radio station came alive. I wasn't expecting a call. The display showed an identification code that didn't belong to any of our equipment. I assumed someone at a regional office had accidentally connected to the wrong channel or something, and so I answered. At first, there was nothing. But then I heard my own voice, and not a recording of something that I'd said earlier. It was me saying hello. I froze, and a few seconds later, the voice repeated it. Hello? It sounded exactly like me. I asked who was transmitting. There was a pause, and my voice said my name. I immediately checked the other radio, and it was switched off. I checked the computers connected to the communication system, and I found no incoming connection. The radio was still transmitting, and I picked up the headset again and asked who was there, but nothing. Then I heard a noise in the background, and it sounded like somebody walking on gravel or something, slow, one step every few seconds. I looked through the window toward the access road. There was nothing outside. I told myself that someone might be approaching from the opposite side of the building, and then the footsteps stopped. My voice came back over the radio, and this time it said something that I'd said earlier that evening. It was a completely unimportant sentence, but I'd complained to myself while making coffee that the generator was running louder than usual. The voice repeated the sentence almost perfectly too. I shut the radio off upon hearing that. The display went dark, and for maybe 10 seconds, nothing happened. Then the speaker came back on, even though the radio was still switched off. I pulled the power cable, but the speaker continued. I heard breathing, then a faint scraping noise, then my voice again. "Can you hear me?" I grabbed my jacket and started walking toward the exit. Before I reached the door, though, the station's internal announcement speaker clicked on. It wasn't connected to the radio. It was a separate system. I heard a burst of static, and then the same voice said my name. Upon hearing that, I just left. I didn't bother shutting down the rest of the equipment properly. I got into the station vehicle and I drove toward the main road, genuinely thinking that I had lost my marbles. About 15 minutes later, I stopped because I realized the radio in the vehicle was making the same damn noise. The strange thing about that, though, is that the vehicle radio wasn't tuned to the station frequency. It didn't matter. The speaker was producing the sound anyway. This time there was no voice, though, but just footsteps, the gravelly ones. I drove the rest of the way without touching the radio, and when I reached the regional office, the morning crew had already arrived, and the supervisor asked why I looked like I had seen a ghost. I told him that the radio had malfunctioned. He laughed and said that that couldn't be right. The station had apparently lost external communications around midnight because of a failure at the regional transmission site. According to him, none of the remote stations had been able to contact the office for at least several hours at this point. I checked the communication logs instantly. There was no incoming transmission from the station during the time that I'd been there. Nothing at all. No call, no connection, no errors. I eventually told myself that the equipment must have just malfunctioned locally or something. Maybe the radio had somehow fed its own audio back into the system. Maybe I'd just been exhausted. Maybe I misheard my own voice or something. But the radio had been left unplugged. I was standing beside it when the speaker suddenly clicked. I didn't touch anything. There was a few seconds of static, and then I swear to you that I heard my own voice say one sentence. I eventually transferred to a different job, and I've never experienced anything like that again. I still work with radios occasionally, and I still hear interference without thinking much about it. But that night, whatever was coming through seemed to know exactly what I was saying. And the worst part, for sure, was hearing my own voice coming through. I never used to understand people who said that a house could make them feel like something was wrong with reality itself. I always assumed that they were just talking about the atmosphere, bad lighting, old buildings, poor sleep, that kind of thing. Then I rented a room that genuinely made me question whether I'd been right about that. This happened when I was doing a temporary work placement in southern Poland. I was staying at a converted apartment above an old commercial building. The place had been renovated enough to look respectable, but the original structure was still pretty obvious to it. Uneven floors, narrow doorways, old brick behind some of the newer plaster. The first few weeks were pretty normal though, but then I started noticing something strange about the hallway. You see, every morning when I walked from my bedroom toward the kitchen, the hallway seemed slightly longer than it should have been. Not dramatically, but maybe by a meter or two. I'd take a few steps and I'd get that uncomfortable feeling that the kitchen door was sort of further away than it had been the previous evening. I'd stop, look at it, and everything would seem normal again. I blamed myself. I was working long hours, sleeping terribly, and spending most of my day staring at a computer screen. Then I noticed the problem wasn't limited to the hallway, though. One evening I was sitting at the kitchen table when I realized that the window reflections didn't really match the room. What I mean is that I could see the reflection of the table, the chairs, the light fixture, but the doorway behind me was missing. Instead, the reflection showed a blank section of wall. I stood up and the reflection instantly changed. The doorway appeared again. I thought that maybe it was the angle, so I sort of moved around the room a bit, but every time that I changed position, the reflection seemed to correct itself. I started taking photos because I wanted proof that I wasn't imagining things. The photos looked completely normal, though. That should have made me feel better, but it just didn't. A few days later, I noticed something else, too. I had a small digital clock beside my bed, and every night at roughly the same time, the display would freeze. Not turn off, but freeze. The numbers would remain exactly where they were for several minutes before suddenly just sort of jumping forward. I replaced the batteries, but it continued. I even bought another clock in the end, but same thing. The second clock would stop at almost exactly the same time as the first. I eventually started writing things down when it happened too. It was always sometime between 1:40 and 1:50 in the morning. And I wasn't particularly frightened yet, but I was mostly just sort of annoyed by the whole thing. Then, one night I woke up because I swear that I heard someone walking through the apartment. Slow footsteps, from the bedroom to the hallway to the kitchen. I remember at the time thinking and assuming that another tenant had come home because that was my previous living conditions, but then I remembered that I was the only person living in my unit. The footsteps stopped outside of my bedroom and I waited, but there was nothing. I opened the door. The hallway was empty, but the kitchen light was on and I was certain that I'd left it off. Upon seeing that, I checked the entire apartment, but I confirmed that nobody was there. I turned the light off and in the end I just sort of went back to bed, not knowing what I could do about it. The next morning I noticed something too that bothered me even more than the previous night. There were wet footprints on the kitchen floor. They started at the sink and continued down the hallway. They stopped directly outside of my bedroom, and there were no footprints leading toward the sink though, only away from it. I took photos before cleaning them, and again I just didn't know what to think about it. Maybe I tracked them in without even noticing. But the prints were clearly shaped like bare feet, and they were completely dry by the time that I came home that afternoon. I finally called the landlord and I told him that there was something wrong with the apartment, and he asked what I meant, and I started explaining the clocks, the reflections, and the footprints. He didn't really seem surprised by it either. In fact, he asked which room I slept in, and I told him. He asked whether I had noticed anything unusual about the wall behind my bed, and I said no, and he told me not to move the bed. That was the first time that I was genuinely weirded out and sort of scared. So I asked him why. He said that the previous tenant had complained about hearing someone walking around at night. Then he stopped talking and I asked what happened to that tenant. He simply said that apparently they had moved out. Well, that night I decided that I wasn't going to stay there permanently. I packed a bag and I left for the night and went to stay with a friend. I didn't even wait until morning. I spent the night at a hotel across town and then eventually went to my friend's place. When I returned the following day, though, to collect the rest of my belongings, something had changed about the place. The hallway and the apartment looked completely normal, and I know that that's weird to say, but it's weird when you live in a place like this. You sort of expect it not to look like this. And for a moment, I felt absolutely ridiculous. But then I walked into the bedroom, and the digital clock beside the bed, it was still there, but it was unplugged. The display was dark. I picked it up and put it in my bag, and the screen suddenly lit up and the number showed 147. I mean, I was standing there in broad daylight. There were no batteries to this thing or anything, and I instantly dropped it. It hit the floor and instantly the display went black. I gathered all of my belongings as quickly as I could, and after that, I never went back. So I was 21 at the time and had just finished an afternoon class at a technical college. I was walking back toward my car through a public botanical reserve on the outskirts of town. It wasn't particularly busy or anything, and there were a few people scattered around the paths, but for the most part it was quiet. One of the paths ran beside a larger open lawn bordered by a shallow drainage channel. There were no buildings immediately around it, no dense bushes, and nowhere obvious for anyone to disappear. And that's when I saw him. He was probably in his 50s, maybe early 60s, walking toward me from the opposite direction. He wore a faded green jacket and light-colored trousers and had a canvas shopping bag hanging from one hand. Nothing about him seemed unusual at all, is what I'm trying to get at. I remember looking directly at him as we approached each other. He was close enough that I could make out his face, and I remember thinking that he looked, well, tired. I stepped slightly to the side to let him pass, and then a dog caught my attention. Somebody was walking it along another path behind me, and the dog sort of suddenly pulled toward the grass, and I looked over for maybe 2 seconds. And when I looked back, that man was just gone. At first, I honestly assumed that he must have turned around, so I looked behind me, but nothing. I looked ahead. No one there either. The path continued straight for like another 100 feet before curving around the lawn or anything. There was no one anywhere near it, too. I walked back to the point where we'd been to pass each other and looked around properly, and I swear to you that there was just nowhere for this guy to have gone. The lawn was completely exposed. The drainage channel was only a shallow depression, and there were a few ornamental trees, but none were large enough to conceal an adult. Plus, I checked behind them anyway. I even walked toward the nearest intersection of the paths because I thought that maybe he somehow turned off while I was looking at the dog, but there was nobody there either. What bothered me most was that I hadn't simply failed to notice him walking away or anything. I had been looking in his direction. He should have been moving. He should have been making footsteps. I should have seen him turn. Instead, there was simply a person in front of me one moment, and then just empty space the next. I stood there for several minutes trying to reconstruct everything. Maybe he had ducked behind something. Maybe I'd confused two people or something. I stood there dumbfounded, going over every possibility that I could think of, but none of them explained the same thing. I had watched a man approaching me from a completely open path, and after looking away for only a couple of seconds, there was just no trace of him absolutely anywhere. There wasn't even a dropped bag or a piece of clothing. Well, eventually I gave up and I turned toward my car. I never told anyone for a long time because I knew exactly how it would sound. But every once in a while I'll remember that afternoon with uncomfortable clarity. I can still picture the man's jacket. I can still remember the way that he was holding the canvas bag. I can still remember the distance between us when I last saw him. And I can still remember turning my head back toward the path and seeing absolutely nothing. I've returned to that reserve several times since then as well, and honestly, I don't really know why. Maybe some part of me expects to find a perfectly ordinary explanation waiting there, or maybe I'm just hoping that one day I'll walk around that bend and see that same man approaching me again, carrying the same bag as though the missing few seconds never happened. There's a particular kind of silence you can experience outdoors that doesn't feel natural at all. It isn't peaceful, it isn't even quiet. It feels more like the environment has suddenly become aware that you're there and is holding its breath. I didn't understand that distinction until several years ago when I was working on a wildlife survey in a remote section of northern Montana. My job? It was mostly routine. I spent long days hiking through forested areas, recording animal activity, checking markers, and collecting measurements for a conservation project. I'd worked outdoors before, so being alone in the woods wasn't something that really bothered me. This particular day had started completely normal too. It was late September, cold enough that I needed a jacket in the morning, but warm enough that I had taken it off by the afternoon. I'd been following an old service trail through a dense section of the forest for several hours at this point. There wasn't another person anywhere nearby, and at some point, I stopped to write something down, and that was when I noticed this eerie silence. I initially assumed that I was simply paying more attention because I'd stopped walking, but then I realized that I couldn't hear a damn thing. No birds, no insects, no wind. The forest hadn't become quiet gradually too. I mean, it had just stopped dead all of a sudden. I stood there listening for probably 30 seconds, then a minute. I remember thinking how strange it was that I could hear my own breathing so clearly. And then something moved. I didn't actually see it, but what I noticed was the air. A few feet away from me, somewhere beyond the trees to my left, the branches moved slightly as though something large had passed between them. There was no corresponding sound of footsteps though, no snapping branches, just a brief distortion in the vegetation and what felt like a pressure change against my face all of a sudden. I instantly turned toward it, but there was nothing there. I waited for a little bit, but I didn't see anything. I told myself that it was probably just a deer. That was the obvious explanation, right? Except, deer would have made a noise. I decided that I'd spent enough time standing there, and I started walking again. About 5 minutes later, I then heard a knocking sound. One huge impact somewhere behind me. I instantly stopped when I heard it, and then another knock came from farther away. Then another one, and 3 separate impacts. They weren't random too. They sounded like somebody striking a tree with a heavy piece of wood. I looked around, but I couldn't see anything. So I just kept walking, feeling very uneasy now. A few minutes later, I heard it again. This time it came from my right though. 1 knock and then 2. I don't know why, but I made the mistake of knocking back, and I hit the side of a tree with the handle of my equipment. Nothing happened at first, and I laughed at myself and kept moving. But then, somewhere deeper in the forest, I heard a single knock and exactly the same sound that I had just made. I stopped laughing at that, and I waited. I started walking faster when I didn't hear anything, but the knocks continued. They never got particularly loud or anything, and that was almost worse, to be honest. They seemed to be moving around me, and one would come from behind and then another from somewhere off to the side, but always sort of at a distance that never changed. Sometimes there would be several minutes of silence as well before another one answered, and eventually I stopped responding entirely. The sounds, they stopped too. By that point, I was no longer interested in figuring out what was making them. I just wanted to get back to my vehicle, if I'm being completely honest. I remember too reaching the clearing where I'd left my truck and feeling an enormous sense of relief when I saw it. I packed everything into the cab and just sort of sat there for several minutes before starting the engine. I told myself that it had to have been an animal, maybe more than one animal, and maybe branches falling or something. I preferred all of those explanations, but the following morning I mentioned the experience to one of the other survey workers. He laughed and told me that I'd probably encountered a woodpecker or maybe a deer, and honestly I just sort of agreed with that. But then he asked why I'd taken a photograph. I hadn't remembered taking one though. He was looking through the pictures that I'd uploaded from my camera the previous afternoon. There was one photograph that I'd taken while documenting a group of trees, and At first glance, it looked completely ordinary. But then he zoomed in, and between two trunks, roughly 30 or 40 yards away, there was something pale. It wasn't clear enough to identify, but, it could have been a person, it may have been an animal, it could have just been a branch catching the light, for all I know, but the shape was standing upright, and it appeared to be looking directly toward the camera. In the end, too, neither of us could really explain it. I didn't report it, though. I didn't want to become the guy who submitted a wildlife photograph and then started telling everyone that he'd photographed something in the woods. So in the end, I just deleted it. I didn't want that heat. So years later, I returned to the area for completely unrelated work. I remember the old service road and decided to see if I could find the place where I'd been that day. And I couldn't. A section of the road had collapsed after a series of storms, and the forestry department had closed the route, and the trail was completely overgrown now beyond the barrier. I stood there for a while looking into the trees. Everything was normal. Birds were singing, the wind was moving through the branches, there were insects buzzing around me, nothing felt strange. And yet, I still couldn't bring myself to walk past that barrier. I've never been able to decide what happened that afternoon. The silence could have had a perfectly ordinary explanation, and honestly, if it wasn't for that photograph, I probably wouldn't have second-guessed it. But that photograph was a little bit weird combined with this, and even the sensation of something moving nearby, maybe it was my brain just sort of interpreting otherwise harmless environmental changes, but I really don't think so. And while I would prefer a more mundane explanation, there's still one thing that I think about often. Whatever was making those sounds seemed to almost answer only after I responded. Maybe that was just coincidence as well, I don't know, but it is odd, right? Either way, I don't knock on trees anymore. Not because I believe that something supernatural lives out there, but because I've learned that when you're alone in the wilderness and something answers you from somewhere that you cannot see, there really just isn't any good reason to find out what happens if you do answer back. So I worked for several years on a commercial crabbing boat operating out of Kodiak, Alaska. Most of the job, quite honestly, was miserable in ways that have nothing to do with the paranormal or anything. Long hours, freezing spray, machinery that never seemed to stop vibrating, and weather too that could turn a calm-looking ocean into something violent in less than an hour. This happened, though, during one of our late-season runs. So, we had been offshore for almost 2 weeks when a storm settled over the area. The visibility became so bad that the ocean seemed to disappear beyond the railings. At night, the deck lights reflected off of the mist and made it feel like you were floating inside of a small illuminated box. There were 7 people aboard. I was working the stern during a gear change shortly after midnight. We had just finished bringing one string of pots aboard when I noticed something moving alongside the vessel. At first, I assumed it was a boy, but then I saw the color. It was a faded yellow survival suit. It was floating upright in the water about 20 feet behind us. I called one of the other deckhands over, and we watched it for several seconds. The strange thing was that it wasn't drifting with the current. It was keeping pace with us. The boat was moving slowly, but the suit remained almost exactly the same distance from the stern. The deckhand grabbed the spotlight and aimed it directly at the water. That's when we realized that there was something inside of the suit, but it wasn't a person. The legs were completely filled with tangled fishing line, sections of chain that looked like pieces of old netting. The arms had been tied across the chest with more rope, and it looked less like something that had accidentally become tangled and more like somebody had deliberately constructed a human-shaped bundle of marine debris or something. The deckhand swore and called for the mate. The mate came outside, looked over the rail, and told us to leave it alone. Honestly, too, nobody argued. We went back to work, and about 10 minutes later, the suit disappeared beneath the surface. There was no splash, and it simply just wasn't there anymore. I thought that was the end of it too, but it wasn't. Around 3 in the morning, the intercom in the wheelhouse activated. We all heard it. At first, it sounded like static. Then came breathing, slow, labored breathing. Someone seemed to be struggling for air in the other end, and the captain grabbed the microphone. "Who is this?" There was nothing, just more breathing. The captain immediately sent someone downstairs to check the communications equipment. The radio systems were functioning normally, but the internal intercom was showing no active connection. The microphone wasn't even supposed to be live. They apparently disconnected the system entirely. The breathing, eventually it just suddenly stopped. And about 20 seconds later, it started coming through the speakers again, and this time it was way louder. The captain pulled the fuse in the end, and the speakers went dead. A few minutes passed, and then the same sound came through the emergency handset in the engine room. At that point, nobody thought it was funny anymore. The handset was physically disconnected from the intercom network altogether, and we eventually shut down every non-essential communication device on the vessel just to get it to stop. And thankfully, nothing else happened that night. The following afternoon, while sorting through a section of damaged gear, one of the crew found something caught inside of a coil of old line. It was a small brass identification tag. The surface of it was almost completely covered in corrosion, but there was a number stamped into it, along with the name of a vessel. The name meant nothing to us, but the number certainly did. It was the hull number of our own boat. That made no sense to us. Our vessel wasn't particularly old or anything, and the identification number had never belonged to another boat as far as any of us knew. The captain, he took the tag without saying anything, and he spent the rest of the afternoon in his cabin. That evening, I asked one of the older crewmen whether he'd ever heard of the boat having another name. He looked at me for several seconds before answering. He said that the vessel had been constructed using sections of an older fishing boat that had been dismantled decades earlier, allegedly. I'd never heard that before. Neither had most of the crew. I asked him what happened to the original boat, and he just wouldn't tell me. He just said that the people used to avoid a particular stretch of water where the old vessel had operated. I assumed that he was messing with me, and maybe he was, but the next morning the captain ordered the brass tags thrown overboard. Nobody questioned him. We finished the trip without another incident, but something certainly changed afterward. Before that night, people would routinely work the stern alone, but afterward, nobody would. If somebody had to go outside after dark, another person went with them every time. And whenever we were working in heavy fog, the deck lights stayed on, even when they just weren't even necessary. I never saw the yellow suit again or anything. I never heard the breathing again, and I still don't know whether the brass tag was connected to any of it. There are probably some explanations for some of it, but I still remember watching that survival suit floating beside the boat, and every time that I do, I just get chills all up and down my body. My father and I had always been interested in abandoned places, so when we found a small historical tour that offered access to an old psychiatric hospital, we decided to go. The building was outside of a small mountain town, far enough from the main road that there was almost no traffic around it. It had been closed for decades and was supposedly being preserved for future restoration. There were only 4 people on our tour, and before we went inside, the guide handed each of us a small electronic detector. He explained that it was designed to pick up electrical interference and unusual changes in the surrounding field. I didn't put much stock into it. I assumed the devices were mostly there to make the tour more interesting. The interior, though, was absolutely enormous. The corridors were pretty narrow and painted in layers of peeling beige and green. Old doors lined both sides, most of them hanging open. The electricity had been disconnected years ago, so our flashlights were the only real illumination. My father went ahead though while I stayed near the guide, and we had probably been inside for 15 minutes when I noticed something at the far end of the corridor. At first I thought it was a person. It was standing just beyond an open doorway, maybe 40 feet away, so I raised my flashlight. The beam, it reached the doorway, but the figure, it didn't reflect any of the light. It was simply a solid patch of darkness, shaped vaguely like a person. There were no visible clothes, no facial features or skin or anything, just a tall human-shaped shadow. I instantly froze upon noticing it. The figure remained completely motionless for maybe 5 seconds. Then my flashlight flickered, and when the beam steadied again, the doorway was empty. I called for my father. He answered from a room farther down the corridor, and I hurried toward him and found him staring at something on the floor. He had discovered an old service hatch that had partially collapsed, and inside was a narrow maintenance space between the floors. The guide crouched down and shone his flashlight inside. That's when we saw the marks. The wood supports were covered in handprints. Not one or two, but just dozens of them. They were pressed into years of dust covering the beams, and the prints were unmistakably hand-shaped, but the fingers were way too long. Some stretched almost the entire width of the timber. The guide immediately stopped joking. My father stood up and told us that we should probably keep moving. That was when the detector in my hand started making noises. At first it was just a faint clicking noise, but then it became a rapid electronic chirp, and when I looked at the display, the reading had jumped far beyond the normal range. The guide took one look and told me to put it down. I tried, but I couldn't. My fingers had tightened around the device without me even realizing it. I tried opening my hand, but it just wouldn't work anymore. Then an intense cold spread throughout my palm. It felt concentrated completely inside of my hand, almost as if something freezing had been pressed directly against my skin. I started panicking. My father grabbed my arm, and the moment that he did, the detector stopped. The display went blank. My hand immediately opened. The device fell onto the floor, and nobody spoke. The guide finally said, "We're done," and we left. Nobody tried to convince us to stay, and outside the air felt warmer than it should have. We walked across the parking area toward the cars without saying much, and just before getting inside, I glanced back at the hospital, and one of the upper floor windows was illuminated, and that was impossible, because, like I said before, there was no power in the building. I thought that maybe it could have been somebody else's flashlight, so I watched the window, but the light moved slowly. It passed across the room and then just disappeared. And a shape stepped into the window, and it looked pretty much like the same thing that I had seen in that hallway, except now I could tell how tall it actually was. It was standing several feet back from the glass, and even from that distance, its head appeared almost level with the upper frame of the window. My father saw it too this time, and he didn't ask what I was looking at. He just unlocked the car, we got inside, and we drove away. Neither of us said a word until we reached the highway. A few miles later, my father asked me whether I had noticed the thing in the window, and I said yes. That was the first time that either of us admitted that we'd seen the same thing. The detector was still in my pocket. I had accidentally taken it with me in all of the confusion and the panic, and I had forgotten about it until we stepped out for fuel. When I pulled it out, the plastic housing was badly distorted around the battery compartment. The batteries themselves had swollen and partially melted, and all of the battery acid had sort of just chewed away through the plastic. There was no other damage to the device, but that was strange. The guide later told us, though, that the equipment wasn't really capable of producing that kind of heat on its own. I never asked him what he thought had happened. I didn't really want to hear the answer. What bothers me the most, though, are the handprints. because when we went back over the photographs that we had taken inside, we noticed something neither of us had seen at the time. There were handprints on the beams above us too, not just beneath them, but above them. What I mean is that the fingers seemed to be pressed into the dust on the upper surfaces of the timber, sort of wrapping around them, in places that would have required someone to be standing on top of the beams, or at the very least be like 9-10 feet tall. I mean, there was no way to reach those areas from the floor, at least not without a ladder or something. And also, whatever made those prints, there were no footprints anywhere nearby. I grew up in a pretty weather-beaten farmhouse in western Kentucky that had been in my family for generations. My great-grandmother used to tell us that the original house had been rebuilt after a fire, and that parts of an old schoolhouse had been incorporated into the renovation. Whether that was actually true or just one of those family stories, I never really knew. What I do know, though, is that house, it never felt empty. There were only 4 of us living there when I was growing up: my parents, my younger sister, and me. But there were times when the place felt crowded enough that I would catch myself expecting someone else to walk into the room. The first thing that I remember was the dining room. We had an old wooden chandelier hanging above the table. It was actually heavy enough that my dad had reinforced the ceiling around it when he installed it. It never swung normally. Instead, every once in a while, it would sort of slowly rotate several inches in one direction and then just stop dead. At first, we blamed the heating systems or the drafts, but then it started happening when the windows were closed and the furnace wasn't running. My mother eventually stopped mentioning it, but the kitchen, that was even weirder. We'd wake up and find drawers pulled open several inches all the time. Not all of them, but usually just 1 or 2, and my dad actually installed magnetic catches on the cabinets after my sister was little, and those catches would occasionally be lying on the counter, despite nobody remembering removing them. I remember asking my parents about it once even. My dad just said, "Old houses settle." And while that explanation certainly worked for him, it didn't work for me. The hallway was where I started noticing the physical sensations. Our bedrooms were on one side of the house, with the bathroom at the opposite end, and at night if I walked down the hallway alone, I would sometimes feel somebody brushing past me. Not a breeze as well, it actually felt like a person was squeezing past my shoulders in a hallway that wasn't wide enough for 2 people. I'd actually move against the wall to let them through in the end, as weird as that sounds. Nothing would ever be there, but sometimes I would even hear humming afterward. It was always the same little sequence of notes too, almost like somebody was quietly singing without words. I'd hear it behind me as I walked, but the moment that I reached the bedroom doorway, it would stop. Every single time it would do this too, and eventually I started rushing down the hallway just to avoid hearing it. My bedroom, though, was definitely the worst part of the house. The room, it had one window facing the fields, and at night, I always kept the curtains closed because of something that I could never explain about the shadows. They weren't normal shadows. I would lie in bed and see dark shapes moving across the opposite wall. Sometimes they looked almost human as well, but never completely, and they would stretch and shrink or slide slowly from one side of the wall to another. The strangest thing was that they seemed to react to me too. If I sat up, the shape would change. If I turned toward the wall, it would move. If I rolled over and tried to ignore it, I could sometimes see the shadow reposition itself in the corner of my vision. By the time that I was about 14, I slept with the lamp on every night. Then, the noises began too. They always started sometime after 1 in the morning, and there would be like a deep vibration somewhere underneath the house, almost like a distant engine idling underground. The window glass would even tremble slightly in its frame, and then came the knocks. Always 4 of them, and they sounded as though somebody was hitting the wooden floor beneath my bed with a closed fist. My younger sister eventually started sleeping in my room because she was afraid of her own bedroom, and that lasted less than 2 weeks. One morning, she told my mother that she couldn't sleep in there anymore because the room feels like there's no air in there. She moved her mattress into the living room and refused to go back. I never did tell her that I'd been feeling the same way. The house, though, also seemed to develop a bit of a pattern whenever something bad happened as well. For instance, my grandfather suffered a serious fall at one point, and a few months later, one of our dogs disappeared from the property and was never found. Then a section of the barn collapsed during a completely calm afternoon, despite having been inspected earlier that year. Each time there had been strange activity in the house beforehand as well, and I never claimed that the house caused any of those things. I still wouldn't, but when you're a kid living somewhere like that, you start connecting things whether you want to or not. Eventually, my parents decided to sell the place, and the day that we moved out, I remember standing in my bedroom for the last time and feeling something that I hadn't felt in years. Nothing. No pressure, no humming, no sensation of somebody standing behind me, just an ordinary and empty bedroom. We moved into a house in a nearby town, and almost immediately, the strange things stopped, like completely. And I haven't experienced anything like what happened in that farmhouse since then. There are still the occasional things that happen that are sort of completely explainable, but that place always felt different. It felt like there was a ghost wandering around looking for someone all the time. And it felt more like the house itself had developed a pattern, and somehow we sort of became a part of it. All the noises, the shadows, the pressure, even the same sounds repeating themselves at the same times became a part of our routine. Whatever was happening there, it didn't follow us, which I was so thankful for. And quite honestly, I am perfectly happy never finding out what would have happened if we had stayed. So I was driving back to my place on a decommissioned access road, about 20 miles outside of my town. It's a straight shot through reclaimed marshland, with no streetlights and absolutely no other traffic for at least 10 miles. I was driving with the windows down, listening to the engine and the tires on the pavement, when I suddenly saw a figure standing near a cluster of cattails about 30 yards off the road. It wasn't right, too. The silhouette was too tall and its limbs didn't seem to hinge the way that a person's would. I didn't stop though, but I certainly slowed down anyway, and almost immediately I felt a strange pressure build inside of my ears. The same kind of rapid pressure change that you get when an elevator drops too quickly. I drove another mile before reaching my driveway, and when I cut the engine, the silence was absolute. I looked back toward the marsh, and that's when I saw the light. Hovering above the distant tree line was an amber-colored sphere. It wasn't pulsing like a beacon. It was vibrating in place so rapidly that the edges of it seemed to blur, almost as though the air around it just couldn't quite keep up with it. I watched it for maybe 10 seconds. Then it shot straight upward. There was no gradual acceleration. 1 second it was hovering over the trees, and the next it was gone into the cloud cover. The only physical reaction was a sudden displacement of air that rattled the car door against my hand. I grabbed my dash camera and tried to record it, but the screen had gone completely static by this point. But then, the strangest thing happened. I looked at the clock on the dashboard, and it read 2:17 in the morning. I remember thinking that couldn't be right. I had left the previous town at 12:41. The drive home normally took about 25 minutes max, maybe 30 if I slowed down through the marsh. I checked the clock when I passed the old maintenance gate though, and it had been 12:53. And there was no way that I'd been sitting in my driveway for more than an hour at this point. I checked my phone, but it read 2:19. My phone showed that I had no calls, no messages, no activity during that period. The dash camera's recording was even stranger too. The file showed me arriving at the driveway at 12:58 and then there was a huge gap. The next recorded frame was me sitting in the driver's seat at 2:16 in the morning. Nearly an hour and 20 minutes simply just didn't exist. I couldn't remember anything between seeing the sphere disappear and looking at the clock. Nothing at all. There's no dream, no images, no sensation of falling asleep or anything. Just a blank space in my memory where more than an hour should have been. I sat there for several minutes trying to reconstruct what had just happened. I checked the road behind me, I checked the car, everything appeared normal, except for the clock. I thought that maybe the dash camera was malfunctioning at first, but when I went inside, I noticed that the same thing happened throughout the house. It had suddenly reset itself to midnight. I thought that maybe the dash camera was malfunctioning, but when I went inside, I noticed the same thing happening throughout the entire house. Every digital clock in the kitchen had reset to 12. The microwave, the oven, the small clock beside the coffee maker, all of them. The furnace was cycling on and off every 30 seconds regardless of the thermostat setting as well, and when I walked into the hallway, the light bulbs were sort of dim, burning with a low orange glow before finally blowing out one after another. I checked my phone again, and the time was still correct on that. That was when I noticed something else too. My left forearm had a thin red mark running around it, almost like I'd been wearing something tightly around my wrist. I don't wear watches, bracelets, or anything else there, and I don't remember getting it. I'm actually sitting in the kitchen right now, and everything is quiet, but the air still feels statically charged. It's the same sensation you get when you stand too close to high-voltage transformers, I think. I've unplugged every device I own. I haven't gone back toward the marsh, that's for sure. And I have absolutely no idea what to make of any of this. I cannot explain where that hour and 20 minutes went. I can't explain why every clock in my house just reset during the exact same period. I keep thinking about that figure standing beside the cattails too, and then I keep thinking about the sphere rising into the clouds, and I just cannot shake the feeling that those two things weren't separate. For some reason too, it feels like something found me, stopped the clock, and then left me with just enough memory to know that I'm missing something. So I rented a small apartment in an aging brick building for about 6 months while I was working a temporary job. The building had been constructed sometime in the 1920s. The hallways, they had new carpet, but the walls were still sort of covered in layers of old paint, and the floors inside the apartments creaked as well whenever somebody walked across them. I lived on the second floor. It was a noisy building too. I could hear televisions through the walls, people arguing in the stairwell, pipes knocking, and occasionally somebody coming home drunk at 2 a.m. all the time as well. So when I started hearing footsteps above my apartment, I genuinely didn't think anything of it. The first time was around 2:30 in the morning. It didn't sound like footsteps exactly, but more like a large piece of furniture being pulled several feet, stopping and then being dragged again, over and over. I eventually mentioned it to the landlord, mostly because it was happening almost every night and it was really bothering me. But he looked at me, confused. The apartment directly above mine had supposedly been empty since I had moved in. Apparently, there had been a plumbing problem that had damaged part of the ceiling, and nobody had bothered repairing the unit, properly at least. I asked if someone was storing things up there, and he told me no, and I just sort of had to accept that answer, at least initially. Then I started noticing things in my own apartment. I kept my kitchen utensils in ceramic containers beside the stove, and every morning they would be arranged differently. At first, I assumed I was doing it without remembering, but then I noticed that they were being separated, forks together, knives together, spoons together, perfectly straight. I started taking a photograph of the counter before going to bed, it was so often, and the first morning after doing that, I woke up and found every single utensil arranged in a perfect line from shortest to longest. and I can assure you that I had not touched them. I stopped leaving anything on the counter after that too. A few days later, I put masking tape across the kitchen cabinet doors before going to sleep, and in the morning, the tape, it had been removed. It wasn't torn as well. It had been peeled away carefully and folded into a tiny square. It was sitting in the center of the kitchen table, and that's when I stopped finding explanations funny. I started avoiding the kitchen after dark altogether, in fact. I ate in my bedroom, kept the television on while I was alone, and tried not to think about the sounds coming from upstairs. Then, one night the apartment door started shaking. I was sitting on my couch when I heard it. It was not knocking as well, not someone trying to handle or anything. I mean, the entire door was shaking in its frame. It was almost like someone on the other side was pressing both hands against it and repeatedly leaning their weight forward and just sort of shoving it over and over again. I didn't know what to do as well. I stood there for several seconds before looking through the peephole, but when I did, the hallway was empty. The motion stopped as soon as I got near it as well, and I waited for another minute, then unlocked the deadbolt and opened the door, but no one was there. But that's when I noticed that the door to the supposedly vacant apartment above mine was open. I could see it from the bottom of the stairs. That bothered me enough too that I almost went back inside, but instead I decided to climb the stairs and see what was going on. The door, though, was actually locked when I got there, which was really weird. There was a thick brass padlock hanging through the hasp, and I stood there staring at it, trying to understand how I could have just seen the door standing open and now all of a sudden it's locked and closed. Then I heard something. It sounded like water. It sounded like someone had turned a faucet on inside of the apartment. Not dripping water as well, but a full stream. I could hear it rushing into a sink, I think, loud enough that it was unmistakable. I put my ear against the door, and the sound became even clearer. Then, all of a sudden, it stopped. Well, I didn't knock. I went back downstairs, freaked out, and after that, I avoided the upper floor completely. A couple of weeks later, I decided to move as well, and while I was carrying the last of my boxes outside, the building manager helped me get one particular heavy box down the stairs, and as we reached the sidewalk, he glanced back toward the building, and then he asked me which apartment I'd been renting. I pointed toward my window. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "You know someone died upstairs, right?" I told him that I'd heard the apartment had been empty, and he nodded. He said that an older man had lived there for years before the plumbing problems. He apparently lived almost entirely inside that apartment and rarely spoke to anyone. I asked what happened to him, and the manager didn't answer immediately, but he just said that the man's belongings had been removed years ago. Then he looked at me and asked, Did you hear the water by any chance?" I remember stopping with the box still in my hands. I asked him what he meant. He wouldn't explain any further. He just told me that the plumbing in that apartment hadn't worked in years. I never told him about the footsteps, about the kitchen, the door, the counter, or anything else. I just never went back. So me, 29 and male, my girlfriend, female and 27, my friend or roommate, male and 28, and my girlfriend's sister, female and 26, moved into some new apartments about a year ago. We haven't had anything weird happen at all, besides the occasional sound every now and then that nobody thinks much about. But in the last 6 months or so, the balcony door will just open. We live on the 3rd floor, no fire escape. It would happen often enough to where we had to be sticklers about locking the balcony door. The rule is that if you unlock the balcony door, you have to lock it back up or it will come open and the cats will get out. Well, we stopped having a problem with the door opening altogether at some point. And about 2 hours before sharing this, I heard someone yanking the heck out of the balcony door. I'm the first one to wake up at like 4 a.m. to get ready for work. Today I happened to be sitting in the living room 10 feet away from this door while sipping on some coffee, and I heard the door handle squeak and the door yank really hard enough in fact for the blinds on the door to stir from the force and stay moving for a good minute. I stared at the door trying to figure out what had just happened. I looked at the lock and saw that it was still deadbolted. Both cats came over to investigate. One of them had their tail puffed up. I just couldn't figure it out and I'd had enough, so I ran to my bedroom and sat there sipping my coffee. The two cats followed closely behind. I was sitting on the bed trying to explain away what had just happened when I could hear the door yank again with a slightly lesser force. I continued to sit in the room out of fear, and I began looking up stories of negative air pressure opening doors and how that works in an effort to find an explanation. But nothing accounts for the door handles squeaking from turning at the same time. I then heard the door yank again, and this time my frustration overcame my fear. I bolted out of my room. I found my friend or roommate, male and 28, standing in the living room. He looked startled from me popping up like I did, but immediately said the balcony door was open. It was freezing in the living room now from the chilly night and the door being just wide open. He understandably must have been a little frustrated too, but I mentioned that the door was locked and told him about what had just happened. I'm not entirely sure if he believes me or not, but he didn't object because the door opening has been a problem for a while. I am a skeptic, always have been. I'm always able to explain things away, but this one, I'm just stumped by. I guess I'm here just looking for explanations as to what this could be, and that if it involves the paranormal, what should I do about it? What I just witnessed is the weirdest thing I've seen outside of movies. So please, debunk it if you think you can. I'll try to respond to any questions below in the comments. I'm going to work now and I'll be there all day for the most part, so I'll get to them when I can. Also, just quickly, I spoke with my roommates. It was confirmed that the door was fully latched and locked that night. I did a full inspection of the door, the hinges, the strike plate, and even the latch mechanisms. The hinges are very tight, not even a little bit of play in them. The deadbolt is working very well and to the fullest degree. The door handle is pretty wobbly, but the rest of the mechanism is fine, which is strange because it didn't used to be like that, and we almost never used that door. I looked for looseness in the strike plate and any unusual bends or anything, but there aren't any. Every bit of the door just works great. I tried yanking on the door myself. There's no way that there can be any movement, let alone enough to cause the blinds to move to the degree that they did. I positioned the handle mechanism to sit just loose enough on the strike plate to not latch but not fully open either. This was very difficult to do, but I then yanked the door a few times, and it takes a great amount of force with both hands to pull the door open from this position. If wind or negative air pressure was the issue, it would have taken a heck of a lot. Which I'm not saying is impossible, but there would be obvious evidence of this for sure. But even if this was the case, the deadbolt was fully latched, like I said. It is also confirmed that there were no windows open that night anyway. I remember it being a very still morning in terms of wind, in fact, and I asked my co-workers along with my roommates if it had been windy at any point in case I missed it. But everyone said that it was not windy in the slightest at all, not even a breeze. I feel really weird coming to the conclusion that an ethereal being of some kind opened my door forcefully, but it's looking more and more like I will have to accept this as my answer. I'm still open to any other ideas to investigate or reasons to explore what could have caused this, but I'm running out of answers, and that is pretty frightening. I never really believed in ghosts, supernatural, or what have you. There were several things that happened where I questioned it, I suppose, but I would just explain it away in my head, even if the explanation isn't even that good. For instance, me and my wife were in bed and we felt a thump on the bed. I turn on the light and there's nothing in the room. At that time we had 2 cats and they were really fat. The thump was very similar to when he tries to jump on the bed. But I checked and they were in the other room, and our bedroom door was closed. I chalked that up to someone hitting the floor really hard one way or another, and we lived in an apartment at that time, and the impact was felt on the bed. So I accepted that and just carried on, even though the question definitely stayed at the back of my mind. But all in all, I've never really seen anything physically, so I just wasn't a believer. That is, until around a few months ago, when me and my wife were watching TV. It was the middle of the afternoon and we heard a thump on our sliding door to the backyard. It sounded a lot like a snowball hitting it. There was snow on the ground at this time, so I go to investigate, thinking that maybe it was my daughter in the backyard throwing snowballs at the door or something. It sounded like something soft hitting it, which is why I thought it was a snowball. I walk up to the glass door and I see nothing out there until something small and metallic hits the glass right in front of my face. I watch it bounce off the glass and land right by my foot and on the rug that I'm standing on. I pick it up and it's a little screw for a Ring doorbell camera. I replaced our old one the day before, and that was one of the extra screws that came with it, and I had put the screw in the box that it came in and put the box in the drawer, which is the direction the screw was thrown from. My wife heard it hit the glass as well and asked, "What was that?" as she was watching me investigate the first sound. When I told her, we were both freaked out. I mean, there was no way anyone threw that. There was nothing but a dead-end kitchen where it came from, and we were the only ones home on top of that. This was the first time that I'd actually seen something and I couldn't explain it away. Even a bad explanation just wouldn't fit. Anyway, days later and I'm waking up for work. It's dark in my bedroom. I'm the only one in there. I have light switches by my head on the wall, but I decided to get up and walk to the end of the room to turn on another light switch that lights up my whole room and not just the headboard. As I'm walking, I remember the incident with the screw being thrown, and I say to myself, what if whatever that was that threw the screw made its presence known right now and scares the heck out of me? And instantly, after that thought was made, I heard a very loud crashing sound coming from the hallway area outside of my door. I get startled and flip on the lights and open the door. My wife was downstairs and comes to the bottom of the stairs asking what was that. I said, I don't know, and go to the laundry room and I see a picture has fallen off the wall and onto a garbage can, knocking the garbage can over, which is what was the sound. Now, either that was a very crazy coincidence, or perhaps whatever it is actually answered me. I told my wife and she got mad at me saying that now she's stuck at home with the kids after I summon the spirit and leave for work. Fast forward a few months and I come home from work and I'm the only one home. It's still daylight outside and I take the garbage out. As I'm walking back to the front door, I feel a little rock hit me in the back of my arm. I turn around and see nothing. I look up and around and see absolutely nothing or no one around. But the craziest thing is that this was caught on my Ring doorbell camera. I've watched it many times, and I can assure you that there was no one anywhere. I could not see the rock on the camera, obviously, because it was too small, but it had to have been thrown from directly behind me, judging from where it had hit me. It was not thrown hard either, but just hard enough that I could feel it. I never could find the rock, but I imagine that it was pretty small because I never picked it up on the camera. Although, I should probably entertain the possibility that it wasn't a rock at all. So before I get started, I just want to let you guys know that I'm going to briefly describe different scenarios that have happened between my sister and me. I also do want your honest opinion on what you think this thing is or these things are, and if you could let me know, I would be very grateful. So, I'm just going to start with something terrifying that has happened to me first. It was around nighttime and I was rinsing something out in my laundry room sink. To the right of me was the back door of our house, and then there was the entrance to the kitchen. My mum had asked me to help her clean around the house that day, so I did. She is my mum after all, and I can't really say no. But I was about to start vacuuming when my mum told me that the vacuum needed to be cleaned out. So as I was emptying it, I noticed a sponge that was part of the vacuum that was very dirty, so I walked over to the laundry room sink to get it nice and clean. I started washing the sponge and drenching it in soap, just minding my own business. As I began washing that nasty sponge, I saw my mum walk past the kitchen doorway. She caught my eye from my peripheral vision, and I wanted to call her over so that she could see how much dirt was coming out of the sponge. And as I shout "Mama," I wait a second expecting her to answer me, but instead, I noticed her walk right past and not even turn her head. I look in her direction, and what I saw, though, was definitely not my mum. The figure that I saw was completely black. The weird thing, though, is that it was built just like my mother, though. She was pregnant at the time, so I noticed that the figure had a belly, and my mum always had her hair in a ponytail just like the figure. The figure had perfect posture, and as it walked past, it wasn't bobbing up and down like it should have been. It looked more like it floated past. I know, very strange description, but that's the best way that I can describe it. After I realized what happened, though, I shouted louder for my mum and she wasn't responding. I left the laundry room to find out that she was sitting outside on the front porch the whole time. She was never even in the house when this happened. I knew then, though, that whatever that was, it was trying to mimic my mum for some reason. Does anybody know if this could have been some type of demon, though? Because honestly, I have no idea. Now I'm going to tell you a story about my sister, Ariana. So one day, she was sitting in her room watching something on her iPad. She had her knees up so that she could place her iPad on her lap as she was watching it. As she was minding her own business, she noticed a figure standing right by the entrance of her room. She described it as being very, very tall, extremely thin, with pale white skin. Its cheeks were sunken in, and it had bright white eyes. The lips, they also looked extremely red, and were abnormally wide, smiling at her. It was very still as it watched her, and she immediately looked up at it. She put her knees down. She got extremely scared, obviously, and closed her eyes trying to convince herself that there was nothing there, that she was just seeing things. But as she opened them back up, that thing that was there, it hadn't left. She threw her iPad on her bed and bolted to her bedroom door, but as she was passing that thing, she said that it moved beside her in a way that, whenever she passed it, it made her bump into its body. She was struggling to get her door unlocked as she noticed its head was fully turned towards her, its body still facing the bed. She immediately ran to my room, swung the door open and just stood there looking at me. I knew that something was off instantly because she just had this look on her face. She looked like she had just watched somebody get murdered, and her face was completely pale, her eyes were bloodshot. I immediately asked Ariana, "What happened? Are you okay?" And as those words left my mouth, she just started sobbing, struggling to get any words out. She literally started hyperventilating, in fact, in fear of what she had just seen. I came up to her, calming her down, sat her down on the bed, and she told me what had just happened. Chills instantly ran down my spine too. I had goosebumps everywhere. Genuinely too, I was terrified for her. This made me angry in a way too, because whatever it was trying to scare her. But my question is, for what? Does this thing seriously not have anything better to do? At this time, my sister was 12 years old, and she continued seeing disgusting things all around the house too. It's a bit like these things that she sees are trying to get something out of her, maybe. Maybe her being scared gives them power over her or something. I genuinely don't know what it could be, but I pray to God every night about letting my sister and I have full authority and power over these entities that we see. Also, only me and my sister have seen things in our house, nobody else. There was even a time when I had a friend over and she saw something at the same time that I did, but I saw the full-on figure as she only saw the shadow. Honestly too, I would think that I was going crazy if it wasn't for the fact that others had seen something too. I've heard things about mediums and how they can feel or see and sort of sense spirits or demons or whatever, and I was wondering if I may have something similar to that. Like, sometimes I'll be sitting in my room and I feel the presence around me change, or when I walk into a room I can tell something is off. I've seen things in other people's houses as well, and I have so many more stories that I could share too, and if anybody wants to hear them, then please do let me know, as it would maybe be therapeutic to share them now. But the fact that my mum, dad, and my older sister have never seen or experienced something in my home, except for Ariana and I, is weird, right? Please let me know what you guys think about everything, and thanks for listening. I, a 28-year-old female, live in a small, seemingly safe, but not so aesthetically nice subdivision. My partner, 30 and male, works in law enforcement, so I am home alone many nights throughout the week. Now, a few months ago, we adopted a small dog, and since I work remotely, I frequently take our dog on walks throughout the neighborhood for exercise and to help with potty training. We've lived in the neighborhood several years, but normally we don't walk the neighborhood much, so we don't really know many of our neighbors. Now that I go outside more, I'm beginning to meet more of our neighbors, which is nice. Usually it's a simple like hello in passing, but there are a few neighbors I now speak to pretty frequently. Everyone seems harmless and friendly. Well, except for this one neighbor who I'll refer to as Bob. He's approximately 50 and male. One day, I was walking my dog, and as I passed Bob doing yard work, he stopped me and said what a cute dog I had. He went on to tell me about his time in the military, training bite dogs, how he was shot and had remnants even behind his heart, etc. And while odd, it seemed friendly enough, I suppose. What I thought was going to be a 5-minute conversation, though, turned into 90 minutes of me smiling, politely nodding, and slowly backing away. I'm going to try my best to retell the conversation from memory, but it's hard because Bob was all over the place and his stories were not cohesive at all. While specific, they were very over the top and embellished as well. Because of this, I won't give too many details for identity reasons. But essentially, he went on to talk about how rich and important he is, along with his family, yet he lives in a mobile home. He said that he's so important that he's had every presidential cabinet on speed dial, that the government has flown him around the world on Apaches to do top-secret missions, that his family had gotten away with murder and it's been swept under the rug by the government, that even Googling his name would have the authorities sent to your door for questioning. He said that he used to be in construction and did masonry work for a bunch of celebrities and still hangs out with a lot of them. He said that he speaks 7 languages, has a black belt in martial arts, and wrestles alligators. He asked me to feel his arm muscle and lifted up his shirt to show me his scars. I could literally go on and on about all the crazy and incoherent things that he said. At this point, I chalked it up to the ramblings of someone not mentally okay. It took a turn though when he asked, "Your old man is the cop that lives down the street, right?" I wish that I wouldn't have made the mistake of saying yes. As a woman, it can be hard to set boundaries with people like this for fear of confrontation or things escalating. But Bob proceeds to tell me how his son, who turns out went to high school with my partner and my partner, really don't get along. He said that he thinks that it has something to do with my partner and his son's baby mama, as Bob puts it. For context though, my partner and I are high school sweethearts and we never really spoke to Bob's son as he was in a different grade than us and we certainly haven't spoken to him since graduating. Neither of us know the mother of the child, but Bob also started making comments on my hair. It's red, which is often fetishized, but he asked me to take my sunglasses off so that he could see my eyes. He then said that I reminded him of an old neighbor that he used to have, and he also said that I reminded him of his daughter. He kept saying that you're a pretty girl and that I reminded him of his daughter. He then proceeds to tell me about all the hot women that he's slept with and how he's been to court for over 50 paternity tests and wants to know if he might be my dad. I'm not originally from this area, and my parents have been together 33 years. No way Bob is my dad at all. I'm sure that I'm leaving a bunch of stuff out, but you get the gist, right? I finally was able to make a break for it, finished my walk, and I instantly headed home. This was about 3 weeks ago, and I no longer go for walks with my dog. I take him to a park or a friend's house instead. But since then, Bob has come to my house and knocked on my door 3 times, the last time being today. I obviously did not answer the door all 3 times. The past 2 times my partner was not home, and today my partner was sleeping. He's a night shift worker. And quite honestly, I'm a little bit freaked out and not sure what to do. My plan was to keep ignoring him, but I'm afraid that it's going to escalate or I'll run into him outside since I still haven't taken my dog out to go to the bathroom. My mum wants my partner to go talk to Bob to see what his problem is or what he wants. Personally though, I think that that's a bit of a bad idea. But what makes this really creepy is that I looked him up on the county's clerk of court's website, and he has a very long rap sheet dating all the way back to the 80s to the present day. It started off with traffic infractions, careless driving, running stop signs, etc., but quickly escalated to possession and dealing of meth and cocaine, several charges in fact, charges of soliciting prostitution, 2 charges of kidnapping, and tons of battery charges, aggravated assault with a deadly weapon, grand theft of firearms, burglary with a firearm, domestic violence, violation of a protection order, and that's all I saw before I genuinely just had to stop. I even thought maybe I was looking at the wrong person, but I confirmed the full name and date of birth, so it's definitely him. I'm going to do some more digging, but please do let me know what you guys think. Do you think that I should do something about this? Do you think that we should confront him? He's obviously mentally unstable, but do I really have something to worry about? Or should I just let this go and get on with my life? This happened in 2005 when I was 4 years old. So my dad was working far away and there was only my mum and me. She said that she was going to buy some food and to open the door to nobody. So I kept watching the TV. I was sitting on the ground and I had the door at my back. We had no actual door there. It was like the shape of the place where a door was supposed to be, but just without one. A door frame, in other words. While watching the TV, I heard my mum close the front door, then get on her bike, turn it on, and I remember listening to the sound of her bike going away, being harder to hear it as time went on until I couldn't hear it anymore. After what I guess was a few minutes, I'd be lying if I said how much time I knew actually passed, I started feeling this coldness. This has been a reoccurring experience through my life as well, which starts in my arms and feet, and for some reason it sort of made me look at my back. And when I did, there she was. This grown woman with exactly my mum's face looking at me, with no expression other than an exaggerated smile while staring at me with those black eyes. She only moved her head a bit while looking at me, and for some reason she kept outside of the room, like the place where the door is supposed to be was stopping her from coming in. I said to her, "Mummy," but there was no reaction. "Hello?" I got nothing from her, just that strange stare and that smile. As she didn't answer, I looked away from her and I just went back to watching TV. Yes, I gave my back to whatever that thing was. And after a few minutes, I would guess, I looked back again, but she was gone. That's when I began hearing my mother's bike again as she was coming back. And then I heard the front door opening and I rushed to her and said, "Mummy, why didn't you say hi before?" She had no idea what I was talking about, obviously, but I can tell you that whatever that thing was, it was definitely not her. I don't remember if that thing had the same clothes as my mum or not, But when my mum came back, the cold disappeared. It is one of the most vivid memories I have from childhood, and I'm wondering, what was that thing? And also, why didn't it ever come in? I was baptized and I would go to church on Sunday. I would pray to God before going to sleep every night that my whole family would be protected. So did that protect me from whatever that was? I really don't know. It's an absolute guess, but genuinely, it's the best thing that I've been able to come up with. So I don't particularly believe in the paranormal. I've had a small number of experiences, of course, that could possibly fall into the category of paranormal, or maybe just a vivid imagination. But this experience in particular happened a little over 5 years ago, and I think it will stick with me for the rest of my life. My ex and I were probably some of the most hard-headed people that you could meet, and this hard-headedness led to us deciding that we should construct our own house with very little help from subcontractors. The property we decided on had a unique history. It was owned in the early 1900s by quite a famous circus owner. On the property once sat a hotel, a water tower and a fountain. Only a fountain and basement of the hotel remained. The property was divided into 4 pieces, and we purchased a piece that only had pillars and a concrete walk hidden in the woods. It was flat, high and dry, and most importantly, cheap. It was everything we were looking for. Now, during the construction of our home, we bought a small camper to live in on the property because who wants to pay rent, right? Definitely not us. We had constructed the house, hired a plumber to do the plumbing, and decided to take it upon ourselves to dig for the underground power without aid of the power company. Instead, we dragged along our younger brothers with pizza, beer, and a little bit of pay. We were all working far into the night as the trencher that we rented, it didn't quite go deep enough, so we resorted to hand digging the last few inches along the 200 feet to the power pole. Since the plumbing worked in the house, we tried our best to use the toilet inside to minimize the amount of waste in our camper tank. We were definitely not fans of cleaning that thing out. I had to pee really bad, so I left the group of guys huddled over the trench digging and ran into the dark house. I didn't bring a phone or a flashlight, just my body. I left the front door open to allow for light to come through from the lights that we had illuminating our work area. I sat down and did my thing, only for the front door, to slowly close. I sort of froze on the toilet as I was completely shrouded in darkness. "I'm in here peeing," I called out, thinking that it was one of the guys. There was no response. All I could hear were footsteps coming toward the bathroom. "It isn't funny," I yelled, thinking surely it must be my ex pulling a prank on me. The footsteps, though, they grew closer and stopped right in front of the open bathroom door. "Stop, please. I don't like it. It's not funny," I pleaded, feeling my heartbeat hard against my chest. "D, stop, for real." And it was then that I could hear what sounded like a soft chuckle from outside the door. Furious and scared, I threw the toilet paper roll. It hit nothing but the floor. "D, please, just stop. You're really scaring me." Nothing. Not a single response. I hurriedly pulled up my pants and stood near the toilet, fear gripping my chest. There was no way that I was walking out of that bathroom at that point. No way. So I didn't. We had a small bathroom window, a bit off the ground, and I climbed out of it as fast as I could. I scraped my arm on the brick getting through, but I didn't care a bit. I ran around the dark side of the house to where the boys worked in the light, and I saw them all there intently working on the trench. "That wasn't funny, D," I said, tears still stinging my eyes and my chest aching. "Well, what wasn't?" he asked, looking up from where he was kneeled over digging. And I could tell in that moment, when they all looked at me, that he was telling the truth and that they were oblivious. So, who closed the door so quiet and methodically like that? Whose footsteps did I hear? Was the soft chuckle my imagination? Following that incident, we completed the house and finally moved in. Our front door would lock us out unexpectedly and for seemingly no reason, despite us changing the lock multiple times. We ended up keeping a spare key outside after being locked out one night with no phones or keys. I awoke from my sleep to find a dark figure standing at the edge of our bed one night. We heard someone whistling a soft tune when we had a bonfire in the middle of the night, and the combination of all of it makes me now lean towards something being there on that property. But the skeptic in me still really loves to deny it. Back in 2020, at the tail end of the major part of the pandemic, I decided to take my family on a trip to Gettysburg, PA. I love history and love reading everything about the Civil War, and Gettysburg is supposed to be a very haunted place, so you would expect to see things out in the battlefield, cemeteries, and old buildings and all that. The following happened at our hotel. Upon checking into our hotel, I had asked the hotel about laundry facilities, as we didn't arrive directly to Gettysburg but landed in Richmond and did a bunch of battlefields along the way. So by the time that we arrived in Gettysburg, we needed to wash some clothes. I tend to pack pretty light, like bring enough clothes for half the trip, but then I do a wash midway. And since this trip was mainly for me and my son, my wife was like, "No, you're doing the laundry." Her way of making me pay for a boring trip for her, I guess. That, and I had to buy her lots of pretty things along the way. Anyway, this evening we got back to our hotel rather late in the evening. I had asked the hotel if it was still okay to do laundry, as there was a sign that said no laundry after I think 8 p.m. or something like that. The woman at the front desk said that there was no one staying in the rooms near the laundry room. I had to run back to the room to gather my laundry and then again back to the front desk because I ran out of quarters. So by the time that I started laundry, it was well past 9 p.m. The hotel had one set of washer and dryer there, so rather than run back over to my room, I was looking up things to do the next day and looking at my phone and watching some videos. I had my body facing the washer and dryer, so off to my left-hand side was the interior hallway that led to the other rooms and the double doors to the outside. The noise from the washer was a bit loud when you were in the room. Then when I had my clothes in the dryer and washer, it was even more loud. I was only paying attention to my phone, not looking down the hallway, however, and I had heard a door open and close. I didn't look and just assumed that someone was there down the hallway. Off to the side of my view, though, I saw a shadow walking towards me from the very end of the other hallway. So I poked my head up and turned to look down the hallway, totally expecting to see another guest or maybe a hotel employee or something. But as I turned, there was no one there. I just assumed that maybe they went into a room. I thought in my head, though, that the hotel told me that nobody was staying near the laundry room, but in the main part of the hotel. You also need a hotel keycard to get in from the outside, so it wouldn't have been a random person off the street or anything. In any case, I just go back to looking at my phone. I turn facing the washer and dryer, not paying attention down the hallway anymore. A few minutes later, I then hear a loud boom come from down the hallway. It sort of sounded like metal poles falling over or something. I then jump up and look down the hallway, but I see nothing again. My load that was in the dryer is finished now, so I'm putting that load in a trash bag and putting the load from the washer into the dryer. As I'm doing this, I see again somebody down the hallway off to the side of my eyes. So I turn and the lights look dim down the hallway, but there's no one there. At that, I started to feel very uneasy, as if someone was looking at me. I have to wait another 30 minutes or so for this load to finish. I started to not face the washer and the dryer anymore, but face down the hallway, a little bit freaked out. I can't tell if my eyes are playing tricks on me, or maybe if I'm just a little bit tired from the trip or what, but I keep expecting someone to just pop out or jump out and attack me. I go out into the hallway to make sure that there actually isn't anybody there. I look around and it's just an empty hallway. The outer doors leading to this part of the hotel are closed too. As soon as my load finishes though, I start packing it in another trash bag. I'm in full get the heck out of here mode. Now that all the machines are off and I can hear clearly, I pack my stuff up and start to head out. And just as I get to the door leading to the outside, I distinctly hear footsteps. I turn thinking that somebody is walking up on me, but again, there is no one there. I leave that wing of the hotel and I make it back to the lobby and then back to my room. My wife looks at me like, "What happened to you?" I said, "Well, I totally believe all those stories about Gettysburg being haunted now because that was an experience." When I was a kid, we lived in a small, isolated house on the edge of a half-developed neighborhood. There were only about 6 houses on our block, and ours was the last one before many overgrown weeds and empty land stretched out into the dark. At night, the area was deserted, and you'd rarely see anyone stepping outside. I lived there from the ages of 7 to 13, and looking back, it felt like I was trapped inside one of those disturbing, uncanny horror films where reality always seems just a little bit off. Now, before I dive into the incidents, it's worth mentioning that our life in that house was filled with a sense of suffocating dread. Financially, we struggled a lot during those years, drowning in debt. Strangely enough, things turned around for us as soon as we moved out. Family fights erupted daily, and I remember feeling terrified constantly. I remember not going too far into any room so that if anything jumps out, I could run through the door easily. I don't know why I did that, to be honest, but it's just how I felt. But here are some of the events that made me believe that something was definitely haunting us. So, I remember staying home from school one day because I was sick. I was curled up on the couch watching Barney and Friends, trying to distract myself from the eerie feeling of the house. At some point, I felt someone standing beside me though. I assumed it was my mum joining me to watch the show, so I didn't think much of it. A few minutes passed and I casually asked her something. There was no response. I asked her one more time and there was no response again, so I turned around to find that nobody was there. But that was when it hit me. My mum wasn't even home and she had left for work hours ago, and I was completely alone in that house. This freaked me out, and I opened the front door and sat on the porch until my parents came home because it just felt that real. It felt like someone was actually there right next to me. This next incident happened to my sister, but I'll explain it from my perspective. We all used to sleep in the same room since our house only had one bedroom, and me and my sister would sleep in between my parents to feel safe. One night, my sister was studying for her test in the living room, and maybe around 12:30 in the morning, I was starting to fall asleep when suddenly my sister busts through the door running and jumped onto the bed scared and was crying. After calming her down, she told us what had happened to her. Apparently she was in the living room studying for a test when, out of nowhere, a yellow ball with a smiley face on it rolled to the hallway from the other room, and as it came to a stop, dozens of cockroaches scurried out from the same room, like they do when they hear humans walking. Our house had a serious cockroach problem, by the way. The floors practically came alive with them at night. She said, though, that a heavy sense of dread washed over her as she stared into that dark hallway. Then she saw it, a shadowy figure emerging from the darkness, moving in a way that made her feel cold all over. She also told us that she felt stuck for a second and froze in fear before she ran into the bedroom, and that's when we met her. On another occasion, one morning, my dad couldn't find his glasses. He had recently undergone cataract surgery, so they were pretty essential. The whole family spent what felt like hours and hours scouring every inch of that house. We checked his shelf multiple times, which was where he usually kept them, but they were just nowhere to be found. Eventually, we left for school defeated and convinced that the glasses were gone for good. But later that evening, as we were sitting around, my dad suddenly called out to my mum, sounding almost angry. We rushed over to find the glasses sitting right there on the shelf, exactly where we had checked over and over again. My dad thought that we were playing a prank on him, but I can assure you that we weren't. Really, there was just no explanation for how they could have reappeared like that. And it wasn't him pranking us either, because he was so mad that day. Now, this next one is actually pretty scary. How would you feel if a random creepy looking guy stood in front of your house and just started chanting? Well, in South Indian culture, there is such a figure. I've not heard much about them, but they are like devotees of God who roam the streets and just sort of randomly tell fortunes to people, but most people avoid them, fearing that his predictions might bring misfortune. My first encounter with one of them, though, was when I was young. I remember hearing a man singing some kind of a religious song near our doorstep, like literally a few meters away from our door. And so obviously I went to check on it, but my mum quickly grabbed me from the back and told me to be silent and to not make any sound. We pretended like there was nobody home, and eventually he must have gone away. But I was really confused and asked my mum who he was, but she didn't explain and just sort of brushed it off. Well, years later, as the strange happenings in our house grew more intense, a similar figure began appearing near our house while my dad was home alone. For several days, this man stood near our door chanting and seemingly delivering cryptic messages at night. Finally, my dad confronted him, telling him to stay away. I never did see that man again after that, but I just couldn't shake the feeling that his presence was somehow connected to the disturbances going on in this place. My sister also had recurring nightmares while we lived there. She remembers one in particular, though, that absolutely terrified her. She would wake up to a vivid vision of a figure, like a yogi or a mystic, sitting on her chest, chanting in an unknown language. She could feel his weight pressing down on her, making it almost impossible to breathe. This vision plagued her as well until we left that house for good. We eventually moved out of that place, and to our relief, the strange experiences almost entirely stopped. Our financial situation improved, the family conflicts became less frequent, and that constant creeping fear seemed to finally lift. I cannot explain what was happening in that house, but living there always felt like I was stuck in a disturbing horror film, one that I desperately wanted to escape. So, my question for all of you guys is, what do you think? Was this place haunted, or was it just the atmosphere of that place getting to us? There are some more stories from that place, and if you would like to hear them, then I'm okay with sharing them, I suppose. So do let me know, because there are plenty more. One year ago, around this time, I was bored and scrolling the web. Nothing unusual for me, but I decided to go on Omegle. Omegle was a now shut down website that allowed you to talk to strangers via video or text chat. It was around for a long time, and I used it frequently when I was younger as a bit of a time waster. There were plenty of creeps on there, sure, but I've had an equal amount of pleasant interactions and conversations on the site too. On Omegle, you could type in tags as well, basically keywords that describe the type of conversation or person you're looking for, and you would match someone with the same ones. I always used alt for alternative. I feel like it weeded out a lot of rude people, I suppose, and connected me to more people my age. For reference too, I was 19 at the time. So, I connected with someone who called himself Kane, and we started chatting via text. He said that he was 23, and I said my age back. We exchanged some small talk, and before I knew it, we were pretty much talking all night. I mean, well, all night in fact. We lived in the same time zone, you see, and I had stayed up until 6 a.m. chatting about philosophy and life and our interests, just because he was entertaining and I was having fun. But when we were talking about our general areas that we live in, he then said abruptly, we should meet up sometime. I laughed initially, but it turns out that he was actually serious. And it also turns out that we only lived like 3 to 4 hours away from each other, so he was really considering this. I am an anxiety-ridden person though, but for whatever reason I thought that he might be normal due to the fact that I'd just spent hours and hours talking to him, and I didn't pick up on any red flags. So I said, sure, why the heck not? I know, this is an incredibly stupid mistake. I have a big heart though, and frequently make the mistake of giving others the benefit of the doubt. So, just like that, we started planning a camping trip. He was set on doing it just days after that morning because that was when he was off work next. I agreed because I didn't have anything to do at the time. I asked for his number so that we could talk somewhere else other than Omegle about the trip. He gave it to me and I texted it, and noticed that the message showed green on my iPhone. This indicated that he was using a Samsung or an Android. Teasingly, I said something along the lines of, "What's up with the Samsung?" After a few minutes, he texted back, saying that he had two phones and that one was for work. That was the first red flag that went off in my head. Why would he need two phones for work at his age? I mean, of course, there's possible reasons, I suppose, but it just set off that intuitive feeling, I guess. One that I regret not listening to in the end. I asked what the job was, and he said that he worked for the state. He added that he isn't allowed to share details about his job because he signed papers saying that he wouldn't, and that he could get fired if he were to violate his agreement. I was still wary of this, but I just figured that he must have worked for a police station or the town council or something to do with law enforcement or something, and that I was probably just overthinking it. Well, days passed and the date for our camping trip approached quickly. He wanted to take me someplace close to where he lives, near a mountain in New York. By the way, don't worry, this isn't near my actual house at all. Obviously, I wanted to do at least a little research about where I was going, so I popped the name into Google. A bunch of results popped up about the soil on the mountain being contaminated with arsenic due to the old mines in the area. All of the government and the state articles that I read said that it was still safe to hike there and that you should wash your skin and shoes after hiking. I still had a feeling of unease about the whole thing, I guess. I texted Kane and asked him why we were going to some place that could potentially be dangerous. He assured me that nothing would happen, and said that he chose the spot because it's somewhere him and his friends frequently camp. This slightly reassured me, I suppose. He does know the area better than me, after all. Now, my parents are definitely over-suspicious of everyone. Strict is also a safe word. For good reason, though. They're just protective, I guess. So I told them that I was meeting up with a friend that I'd met over a video game, and that I'd already known him for a month. I knew this would be less likely to freak them out than the truth, and they were adamant that this was a horrible idea, but finally let me go off when Kane pulled into my driveway. He didn't come inside, and waited outside of his car for me. After a brief introduction, my mum rushed out to meet him and asked a few questions about the area that we were headed to, and then we were off. We pulled into the Starbucks by my house so that he could get a coffee, since he was tired from the drive up there. We sat in his car for about maybe an hour and a half afterwards, and during that time he asked me to rate the playlist that he put on, and showed me how he writes down every single song that he likes in a little notebook that he kept in his car. I thought that was a bit weird, but kind of sweet as well. Like, what guy these days writes down songs, right? After an hour or so passed, though, I told him that we should get going so that we can get to the campsite before dark. He kept saying just 5 more minutes, though, and after about 30 minutes of insisting that we need to leave to make it on time, he finally let us start on the road. While we drove the 4 hours up to our destination, Kane mostly talked about himself. He told me long stories about his friends and a girl that he used to date that he doesn't like. I thought that this was a bit strange. Who talks about another woman to a girl like this? After telling stories for about 2 hours, I tried to deviate to a brighter topic and asked what kind of things that he's into, hobby-wise. I already knew the stuff that he told me online, but I was trying not to suffer from awkward silence or any more of his weird ramblings. He said that he thinks that eating healthy is important, and that people who eat junk food are stupid. He also says that he only wears sustainable clothing that's made from cotton or wool. I don't have a problem with being sustainable at all, but he was saying it in a really sort of, I don't know, obnoxious way, I guess. Then he turned to me and asked the first question about me since we had gotten into the car. What brought you to Omegle? I told him that I was bored and that I like meeting new and interesting people, and that was about it. He nodded slowly in thought and grinned, showing the most expression that I've seen on his face so far. He said that he likes to go on Omegle and tell people that he's a soldier in Russia, and that he was torturing people as he spoke to them. I sat there in silence and just kind of stared at him, waiting for him to say that he was just kidding and that it was just some sort of messed up humor. But he didn't. He just laughed and said, "What?" Well, as we neared the campsite, I mentioned that I was getting kind of hungry. He said that we can stop at Whole Foods before going to camp for the night. In my head, I sighed about this, knowing that he was probably going to judge me for whatever I picked out there, but it wasn't a problem for me and I was hungry, so I agreed. In Whole Foods, he made me pay for both of our meals because his card wouldn't work there. He didn't even try, in fact. This annoyed me, I'll admit, but I was just eager to get to camp, so I paid and we sat down outside to eat. After about maybe an hour, we were finally ready to get to camp. So we drive up the mountain and he pulls into a small parking area with about 3 spots. Cars were parked there and older men were surrounding the car smoking some weed. Nothing they were doing was wrong, at least morally, to me. But it just made me uncomfortable that they were there so late at night. Before I could even mention it though, Kane says that it's too cold for him to carry our supplies to the campsite, which was about a 10-minute walk, and set up camp. I was taken aback by this. I said, "What do you mean? I'll help you. We didn't come up here for nothing." He insisted though and told me to get out of the car and to feel how cold it was. He said it would take a while to pitch our tent and that it was too much for us. Now, there was no way that I was getting out of the car and facing the men in the parking spot next to us, so I rolled down the window halfway and stuck my hand out. It was freezing, I mean, he was right about that. That night it was in the 30s and the wind chill felt worse being higher up. I was annoyed though, but I agreed in the end to sleeping in his car for the night. I was sad that our trip was basically wasted, to be honest, but it was the best that we could do. He sat in silence for a while, seemingly uncomfortable that I was annoyed and unsure how to comfort me. I slinked back into the passenger seat and started to scroll on social media, just trying to pass the time. He grabbed my phone out of my hand and said, "Come here." He patted his lap. I was already annoyed at the situation and confused on what he thought he was doing. I said, "You're funny," and reached for my phone that he had tossed onto the floor of the car. Before I could get to it though, he reached over and scooped me out of my seat and tossed me onto the back seat. Now, I don't remember most of it, but my eyes were squeezed shut and I was just praying for it to end. After he was done, he pushed me back into the seats and got dressed. He smiled at me and said, "How was it?" I just stared back at him with tears in my eyes. He climbed back into the front seat, propped his feet up on the wheel, and then he just went to sleep. I didn't know what to do. I sat there motionless in the back seat for about 2 hours trying to process what had just happened to me. I considered calling my mum, calling 911. I thought about it for what felt like forever. I already had been assaulted once in my life and it broke my parents' hearts. I knew that learning of this would absolutely destroy them, and I was also afraid of what would happen if I actually told them. Like, I didn't want my dad or my brother to go to jail for life because they were angry and got revenge against this guy. So I just sat there all night, watching the men outside stare into the car and smoke on their joints. I don't remember falling asleep, but eventually I woke up to the wind hitting the car. I was in a fetal position sitting upright, holding my legs in my arms. Kane noticed that I was awake and said that it was time to go. I was actually scared of him, and it felt like my heart was leaping out of my throat. Adrenaline was pumping through my body, and I started scanning the back seat and our overnight bags for something that I could use as a weapon in case he were to pursue me again. I ended up holding onto my full metal water bottle, and it wasn't deadly by any means, but it could knock someone out, and holding it made me feel safer, that much was for sure. I stayed in the back and Kane started driving. I asked where we were going and he said to get breakfast, almost as if that was obvious and it was silly of me to ask. After driving down the mountain back into the city, we pulled into a parking garage and he tells me to get out, that we're here. I get out of the car and cling close to it, not wanting to let him get behind me. I was thinking about making a run for it, honestly, but didn't want to risk getting chased and overpowered by him again. I followed him to a little Mexican spot on the corner and he told me to order pancakes so that he could have some. This obviously ticked me off even more than I already was, but I didn't say anything because I was afraid that there would be consequences if I showed negative emotions at this point. I ate a few bites of my food and he happily ate the rest of my plate. He paid quickly with cash and took me back to the car, where he lay down in the back seat. He said that he was going to take a nap because he didn't sleep well last night. I didn't want to argue with him, so I let him sleep. And he slept for about 3 hours. The whole time I was watching YouTube videos trying to calm myself down and keep a clear head. It was about 9 a.m. and around this time my mum was waking up and texted me saying that she wants me to be home. I told her that Kane was taking a nap and that I would be home soon. She didn't like the sound of that and insisted that I come home now. I was happy to have a reason to get the heck out of there, to be honest, one that might be convincing to Kane too. So I woke him up and he became angry with me, saying, "Don't wake me up next time. Play on your phone, watch TikTok or something." I was shaking, but I managed to say that my mum wanted me home and that we needed to go. He said to let him sleep for 30 more minutes and told me to set a timer on my phone, and so I did. 30 minutes though felt like 30 hours, and once it went off, I woke him up once again. This time I filmed myself waking him up because I was afraid of what was going to happen. He was angry once again, and I told him that 30 minutes was up. I asked to leave, begged him to leave in the end, and he said no. Over and over, he said that we weren't leaving yet. I was now shaking uncontrollably, but I put on a brave face and pretended like I was being playful. I said, "Okay, I'll just get an Uber then." I turned around and started to open the car door when I felt his hand grab my shoulder and dig into it, yanking me back into my place. I honestly think that I blacked out from fear for a few seconds. He said, "What the heck are you doing?" His hand was still on my shoulder, his fingers squeezing into my skin. My mind was racing and I was on the verge of tears. This caught his eye and I quickly played it off by saying that my mum would call the police to come and get me if I wasn't home soon. I had mentioned earlier that my dad works in law enforcement, so this was a little bit more believable of a lie, I guess. And at the mention of police, something changed in his face. He looked frantic. He let go of me and unhappily agreed to drive me home. I felt a deep relief, the deepest relief that I've ever felt, and swallowed the lump in my throat as he climbed into the front seat and started our 5-hour drive back to my house. The drive back was much quieter than the drive up. I didn't say anything unless he initiated. I just gripped my phone in my hand and tried not to make eye contact with him. I wondered if he had any remorse for what he did in those moments. When we reached the town where I live, it was about 11:30 at night. Kane pulled into the main strip to get to my house, and I saw flashing lights behind me. Honestly, my first instinct was to be scared because my dad is a cop, and so I've always made extra sure not to break any traffic rules. The police pulled us over though, and 2 men stepped out of the cop car. I frantically rolled down my window so that they could see my familiar face, the daughter of their boss. One of them greeted me and looked both concerned and disappointed that I was in the car with someone getting pulled over. The other cop told Kane to get out of the car while I explained what we were doing out so late. Obviously, I spared the illegal and horrific details. I was tired, scared, and I needed to be safe in my own home. I also didn't want them waking up my sleeping dad with such bad news. I overheard the second officer ask Kane about his information, though, when he said, "What's your name, son?" Kane mumbled something and he said to speak up. The name that he gave was not Kane, though, and he told the officer that he was 22, not 23. My heart sank into my feet and I sat there motionless while they explained to Kane that he had missed a stop sign and that they were letting him off with a warning. They told me to get home and I nodded my head. When we pulled off, I let my emotions take over and I started screaming at the stranger that I was sitting next to. "Why did you lie to me? What is wrong with you?" He looked distressed from the volume of my yelling and told me to calm down, that he was sorry that he lied. He said that he only lied about his identity for his own safety. That honestly baffled me, considering that he had just assaulted me. I screamed at him all the way to my house, and as we pulled in, I threw the car doors open and started throwing my stuff out onto the lawn, desperate to just get far away from him now. He tried to talk to me, to offer more pitiful excuses for his disgusting actions, but I screamed at him to get away from me and that I never wanted to see him again. I gathered my stuff off the lawn and hauled it into my room while my parents slept soundly, unaware of the terrible secret that I had. I eventually woke my mother up and told her that I was home as she had requested. Once I got to my room, though, I just broke down. What happened to me was starting to sink in. As I was sobbing silently into my blanket, my phone lit up from a text from Kane, and it read, "I'm sorry about what happened, I really am. If it makes you feel any better, I just got pulled over, so that's my karma, I guess. Let me know if you want to talk." I felt a wave of nausea hit me like a train. I screenshotted the message, blocked his number, and deleted his contact. And I haven't heard from him since then. In fact, I haven't hung out with anyone since then besides my boyfriend, who, thank God, is normal. I still think about what happened almost every day, though, and I still feel sick when someone I don't know gets too close to me, even if it's just a stranger passing by in the grocery store. I know that what happened was the product of my own irrational teenage actions. I get that. I know that I shouldn't have met up with someone that I didn't know, but I had faith that he would be a normal person, somewhat at least. I wish that I could have listened to my instinct and to my parents' warnings. I still don't know what would have happened if I didn't make up that police story, and to be honest, I really don't want to even think about that. I'll never meet up with someone again that I don't know, though, and while trying to cope with what had happened to me, I eventually Googled the mountain again, and I found a link that said Cane Mountain North Trail Loop, New York. Now, if you've made it this far, or you're taking anything away from this story, then please let it be this. Trust your instincts and trust your gut. If something feels wrong, then it probably is. And obviously, don't meet up with strangers, no matter how good they look or how normal they may seem. I worked in a jail for over 10 years in the control booth, running doors, cameras, radios, phones, you name it. I still work for the agency that runs it, but I no longer work at the jail. But I saw and heard a lot of stuff. Most of it was non-paranormal stuff, but you would often hear like strange noises and banging. Usually it was an inmate or door noises, but the side of the basement where the staff locker and the weight rooms are is admittedly creepy, and I often felt watched when I was down there by something other than the cameras. I've heard a couple of stories from trustees saying that they saw a black shape of a person standing in an empty cell or wet footprints in the kitchen when no one had been in there all night. Our IT tech also claims to have caught EVPs while in the jail, but I haven't heard them, so I cannot confirm either way. But I have two stories that have always stuck with me, one from a co-worker and one that happened while I was there. So one night my co-worker answered the phone, and it was a mother calling about her son. She gave his name and her name and said that her son had just been arrested for driving under the influence and she wanted to bail him out. My co-worker explained that her son hadn't arrived at the jail yet and would have to go through the booking process before he could get bailed out. My co-worker explained to her how to bail him out and where the jail was, to give the jail a call a little bit later to get an update. She asked that he let her son know that she was going to bail him out though. The son was eventually brought in by the arresting officer, and my co-worker had a correction officer pass on to him that his mum was bailing him out. My co-worker listened to and watched the entire exchange between the son and the officer as the officer told him the message. The son was shocked though and stated loudly, "No, she's not. You're messing with me." The officer said, "I know my guy. He wouldn't mess around with you like this." But then the son said, "My mum is dead." They then confirmed the mother's name with the son, and it was the name given by the woman on the phone. My co-worker swears up and down though that he talked with a woman saying that she was his mum. The man would not be on the roster yet, but it could have been someone who heard his name called over the police radio, or someone who was with him at the time who was trying to mess with him, I suppose. On another occasion, my story happened not long before I left the jail. So a few years before the incident I'm talking about occurred, a man had unfortunately self-deleted himself in one of the cells. The night that I'm talking about, one of the officers was doing his regular check of the units and came up to the cell the man was in a few years before. And the man that we had housed there was sitting up on his bed, facing the door which has a window. He had a blank look on his face and his eyes were open wide. He looked the officer straight in the eyes and said, "You couldn't find the man who had self-deleted in time, and you won't find me in time either." The man was brought down to a cell where he could be monitored, and we went from there. The officer said though that he had to yell and shake him to get him to respond, as if he was waking him up from a sleep. He was asked later what he knew about that cell, or if he knew the man that he had named, and he said that he didn't, and claimed that he didn't even remember saying anything. And yes, the officer in this story was working the night that the man had unfortunately ended his own life. So I haven't had any remarkable experiences of my own, but I'm certainly not a disbeliever either. I have a 5-year-old son. His dad, myself, and him will often stay over at my father-in-law's house, as my father lives across the street, and my brother-in-law lives in the house behind that yard. My brother-in-law has a 2-year-old boy, who my son plays with every time that we're there. They're very close. His name is D, and D goes home around 8 to get ready for bed. He's never out at dark or by himself, and for backstory, this house has a bit of a, I guess you could say, vibe to it. I won't say bad, but it seems to bring out bad emotions for people who are frequently there. So much so that my father-in-law's late fiancée succumbed to her poor mental health in a fiery way in that home, and my boyfriend and I will find ourselves angry and fighting at night there too. Not typical or over any real things either. This is also common for everyone who visits or has stayed there. Certainly not bad enough that we don't come around or anything, but what my son heard may just change that, at least at night. You see, a couple of nights ago while staying the night, about an hour or two after D had already went home, my son stops playing and starts running to the door, saying that D is here. I just heard him say my name. When we told him that D was at home and in bed, my son said, "No, I just heard him yell my name. He wants me to go and play with him." There was absolutely nobody else but my son and my boyfriend in that house, and we didn't hear anything at all. For how close the call he had heard came from, we should have heard it too. D is very excited over my son and is quite loud when hollering for him, and my son was genuinely confused when we verified that D was at home asleep. So, could this have been something trying to mimic D to lure my son, or just a 5-year-old boy's imagination? He seemed very convinced that somebody had called him. It definitely put a chill down our spines. When I was little, my mum would always tell me that there are ghosts that stay near the windows, waiting for a child to come closer so that they could push the child off. I did believe it for a while. I mean, I was just a kid. But later I thought that it was just a way for my mum to keep me from going near the open windows. I mean, it made sense. Open windows were obviously dangerous for a little kid. Now, when I was around 7, we lived in this house which had another house in front of mine. The houses weren't separated by a street, but by a small little field, concrete, not grass. The family in front also had a daughter, around 2 to 3 years younger than I was. However, we never really interacted with each other, nor did I know her. Mind you, this was during the time when I had come to the conclusion that my mum's window's ghosts were not real. I was sitting by the window looking outside when I saw the little girl sitting by the window as well. She had noticed me as she was looking down. Apparently, she was waiting for her dad to come home from work. There was no one around her, and as I was looking, I suddenly noticed something move behind her. It wasn't very visible as the lights weren't on, but that was quite normal considering that it was around 4 p.m. and the sun was still out. But this is when I noticed that there was a shadow behind her, a man specifically. I barely had any time to register what I had actually seen before the girl literally falls out of the window onto this little space right below her building. It was covered by another wall, so I couldn't see what had happened. The girl was eventually rushed to the hospital, though. She had only broken one of her legs and her nose, and if I remember correctly, her face had been a little bit mangled due to the height that she fell from, but all in all, she was okay and she survived. But let me tell you that seeing that shadow figure scared me so much that I stopped altogether going near any window if it was open. I don't know what happened to the girl later or where she is now, but I will never forget the shadow that was behind her that day and how she fell straight out of that window upon seeing it. This might be a bit of a long one, so please bear with me. When I was 9 years old, my best friend Matt's parents offered to take us and his 2 younger siblings to a place called Discovery Zone in the next city over, about 40 minutes away. We had dinner afterwards and then headed back to our town where I would sleep over at Matt's house. We lived in a part of the east side of town that was pretty rough, and there was a large swath of undeveloped land between the main road and the entrance to our neighborhood. On either side of the access road, between the two, were prairies overgrown with brush and weeds, and really nothing to speak of for maybe about half a mile in any direction at that time. Matt, his older brother, and sister were crashed out, and I was awake looking out of the window of the red Chrysler minivan that we were riding in. Now, it's important to note that as a kid, I was afraid of everything. I really mean that too. I used to turn off the light and sprint up the stairs. I used to sleep with the covers all the way over my head, leaving only a small opening for air, and I wouldn't even dream of watching a horror movie. So as I'm looking out of the window into the empty prairie on the right, that was when I see her, clearer than should have been possible thanks to the moonlight, a tall, frail woman, hunched over a bit, with long, thin, stringy hair. Everything about her was spindly, and I couldn't even tell that she was soaking wet as if she'd just come out of a river or something. Then, as I fixated on her, she stopped walking and turned her head, and she saw me. As she raised her head to look at me, I realized that it wasn't a woman's head on her body, but that of like a horse or something, whose white hair was made grey and muddy by the water and the dirt. Not only that too, and although I couldn't see it perfectly, I knew that the horse's eyes were cloudy and milky, blind with age or disease perhaps. Now, here's the strange bit though. I wasn't afraid of her. In my mind, a voice was telling me that it was okay, that I had seen her and she had seen me now, and I didn't have to be afraid. My family and I are from Mexico, and I grew up in the Southwest, so I immediately equated what I saw with La Llorona, who all of us kids had heard of as a cautionary tale, to get our butts inside before it got too late or too dark. I never told a soul about seeing her, and I never really thought about her again too. That is, until March of 2020. Now, during the COVID shutdowns, I spent a lot of time online, and much of that was on certain paranormal message boards. They used to be cool. One afternoon, I was scrolling through endless threads there when one caught my attention. Share your scary or paranormal experiences about Mexico. Reading through each of them was actually pretty fun, until I came upon this one from a guy who used to date a girl from Mexico. Her uncle owned a mango grove there, and while the guy and his girlfriend were walking through it one day, he kept noticing an old woman ducking behind the trees. Finally, he asked the girlfriend who the lady was, and she turned to look, just catching a glance of her. The girl grabbed her boyfriend by the wrist and instantly took off running without a word until they got back to the house. She breathlessly told her uncle that there had been an old witch spying on them, and that when she looked at her, the woman had a white horse head in place of her own. Upon reading that, every hair on my body was standing up, but it was the attached comment from another user that made my blood truly run cold. You see, his father and his friend had been partying in Mexico one night when they were young men, and were driving back when they saw a young girl walking along the side of the road with her back to them, hunched over. She was dripping with water, so they stopped to see if she was okay. When they approached her, she turned to face them, and they just took off sprinting back to the car because, again, she had a white horse head, and the friend said that its eyes were milky, clouded, and blind. Now, I could accept the argument that whatever I saw as a kid was just pure imagination, but how is it that I imagined the exact same woman that these guys saw? I looked for any precedent for the Rona having a horse head and came up with nothing, but fast forward another few years when I went to Universal Studios Hollywood Horror Nights, and they had a La Llorona-themed haunted house, and wouldn't you know it, they gave her a skinned, bloody horse head. My husband, 23 and male, and I, 22 and female, have been on our wedding anniversary for over a week now. We have a camper in Cherokee, North Carolina that we've been staying in. We have an interest in abandoned things like towns and cemeteries and whatnot. So we decided that we would go and visit Connor Cemetery. It's near Couches Creek off of Newfound Gap Road, which is about 1.9 from the visitor center. Anyway, when we arrive to pull off close to where the trailhead is supposed to be, we get out and start walking towards the opening in the woods where there is a trail. The trail itself is visible, but you would have to be looking for it to see it. We're walking in, heading towards where the cemetery is supposed to be. I'm in the front looking down, checking for snakes and holes, and my husband is behind me. We've paused for a second, and he said, "Hey babe, look at that statue." I start looking around and say where, and he points to the direction. What I was expecting was like an angel statue that you would normally see in cemeteries. But that is not what this was. I look upwards further up the trail, and off to the side is what looks to be a 12 to 15 foot tall deer or elk statue. The statue looks like it was either made up of wood or wrapped in leather hide and looked preserved almost. The problem is that nowhere online had it mentioned this statue or anything of this sort. It starts giving me this uneasy feeling because it had a strange face and it was just a very weird place for something like that to be there. My husband then said that he didn't like the look at it at all and we should probably go. As soon as he said that, we turned around and left as fast as we could. Once we got back to our car, I told him that it just didn't feel right at all. He agreed with me and said that he saw a deer-like face with a snout and he thinks that he actually saw it blink and its right ear had moved, but Not like a normal animal ear, but a full-on 360 rotation. I told him that what I saw was like an elk body with a camel mixed with an elk-like face. On the way back to our camper, I started thinking that I should have taken a picture of it, but unfortunately I just didn't think to do it at the time. Once we were back at the camper, we started researching things, and we just could not find where this was ever listed or ever even seen before. We decided to go back to a local Native American bookstore that we had gone to previously and speak to the older lady who runs it there. We had explained what had happened, and she advised us to speak to the visitor center in the national park to see if anyone had something similar or if they knew of any native stories of something similar to this. She had also said that sometimes the things choose for you to be the only ones to see it. We had thanked the lady, and then we left back to our camper. Now I'm here with all of you guys and thinking about what we may have possibly seen out there in the middle of the woods, in the middle of nowhere. If you have any information on what this could be, then please do let me know. We'll be going to the visitor center tomorrow, and most likely we'll be going back into the woods to see if it's still there or not. My hunch is that it won't be. I'll start off by saying that this isn't the first time that I've experienced something paranormal. I've actually shared another story here before, but this one, oh boy. So the first event took place on my birthday. I had this stoner friend who did drugs all the time and gave me a hardcore LSD square. I, being a complete idiot, thought that it would make for a good birthday, so I just put the whole thing on my tongue and started sucking on it like it was prime Angelina Jolie's lips or something. My friend starts telling me that I'd have to wait about an hour for it to start kicking in and how the trip would sort of feel like, and he's telling me all this stuff, and I start feeling like my stomach's being drilled all of a sudden. The room that I was in immediately shrank, and it felt like I was going to choke. I tell him about it, and he says, "Oh, it's probably kicking in already because it's your first time and you took the whole thing." So we get out of the apartment and sit in a garden outside of the building. It must have been like 8 p.m. by then. And while I'm sitting there, everything that had a texture became alive, and it was really nice. The walls with tiny rocks in them, plants, all of it. My friend also put on some music, and I was enjoying it. Little did I know. At this point, I start seeing people bursting in like flames. It was like a fire or something would flow from within each person that I saw, but it was different for everybody. Some people would come up to me and I would start having trouble breathing, and other people would have this beautiful soothing light coming from them that would calm my nerves. I was super sensitive at that moment. And it's kind of funny that I found it hilarious, I guess. Anyway, my friend and I started walking to a little bar to get a couple of beers. He stopped in the way to greet a dude, and I swear that I could suddenly read his thoughts. Like, I would know what he wanted to say before he even said it, and then he would. I started getting a bit nervous, but I expressed it with complete and utter silence. But when we arrived at the bar, I started hearing voices. They would repeat old conversations that I had heard when I was a little kid and completely forgotten about. Like me being a 2-year-old and hearing my mum talk to a neighbor about God and how she felt that we were abandoned in this world. Every word, every sentence in fact, hundreds of forgotten conversations flooded my head suddenly, and I would know why and when they were talking about those things. Amid this madness and psychosis, I could recognize a pattern in these memories. They were all dialogues that discredited God in some way or another. But as soon as I became aware of that, I started feeling like I was being pulled from my own body forcefully. I started freaking out, but my friend literally left me sitting by myself because he went to do something in the bathroom. And look, I know, what do you mean by being pulled out from your own body, right? Let me put it this way. So, you are your personality, right? Your thoughts, your feelings, memories, dreams, your soul, I guess you could say. That was what I felt was being taken away from me, and the more that I felt I was no longer in control, the more I would feel like I was losing my mind, like going crazy, never to return to myself ever again. Upon that realization, everything became visual too. I saw a literal bunch of figures all around the bar that I was at. Some were sitting next to people who were just having a good time, others were vibing and singing loudly to Viva La Vida by Coldplay. These figures, though, they were all black, and the only thing that I could notice in them was these red glowing eyes. But just before I completely lost my mind, I guess you could say, I heard another voice, but it wasn't in my head. It was like coming from within me almost. Leave this place. Something bad is about to happen. You don't belong here, my son. In perfect Spanish, which is my native language. That voice obliterated every other voice that I was hearing, and I immediately stopped feeling what I described a while ago. My friend had already come back, and so I grabbed him by his shirt. I said to him, something bad is about to happen, let's get the heck out of here. And he went, nah man, you're just horror tripping. I knew that this was going to happen. And as he's yapping along, we suddenly hear people screaming and a flying bottle passed right between us and crashed against the wall that we were sitting next to. Then, a huge fight broke out due to some drunk, dangerous people that happened to be there or something. My friend was terrified and started running out of the bar suddenly. We got out of there as quickly as we could, and as we were walking back to his house, he asked how I knew that that was going to happen. While my brain was, well, just malfunctioning, he said. But it was way too much to take in at that time. I didn't understand anything that had happened. Eventually, I came down from the trip and things started to become clear. I was no longer high. And I mean, I had practically been high all my life, and for the first time I was completely lucid. But I saw, I heard, and I felt it. And at that moment I felt like God was real, and I had felt him for the first time in my entire life. I mean, it couldn't have been anything else to me. I just knew. A week passed, and I'm in my room, and I decide to get on my knees and pray. I said that if he was really listening, that I wanted him to send somebody who could teach me how to look for him, how to connect with him, and if he did, that I would never walk away from him. The next day, I heard somebody knocking on my door at 6 p.m. I went to see who it was, and it's a neighbor that I had seen before, but I didn't really know him or talk to him very much. Hi neighbor, God bless you. I'm just stopping by to invite you to a Bible reading at my house. He named his house and street. It's the first Bible reading of many that will come, so I hope you'll join us. There'll be snacks and everything. My eyes watered instantly, and I said yes. And a little over a year has passed since then, and although I'm not a very religious person, I guess you could say, I do have a relationship with God, and I can 100% affirm that my heart has changed a lot since that time. I'm certainly still flawed in many ways, but I am a completely different person, and carry a very different life than the one that I used to. This was a very personal experience, as you can probably imagine, and I've been trying to get this off my chest for a while now. You know, sort of give my testimony, I guess. Obviously, you can take it or leave it. It's the same for me. I mean, it's out now, so that's that. But still, my advice would be, don't go anywhere near drugs, especially LSD and hard stuff. And also, be aware that there are some dark things out there. Dark things like I saw at the bar. Things that I wish that I had never seen. And may God bless you all. This happened about 17 years ago during summer break. My friend and I, we went to visit another friend who was staying in this tiny remote village in Belarus for the summer. The house was his grandparents', and the whole place felt super isolated. Honestly, it was actually a lot of fun at first. We went swimming at a nearby lake every day, and at night we'd stay up late just sitting by the water and whatnot, listening to the kind of deafening silence that you only get in the countryside, and just talking for hours. During the day, we'd go mushroom picking, explore the area, take pictures, and just make some really good memories together. We stayed for a few weeks, but then one of my friends had to leave early because of some family stuff or something. The only way out was a bus that came twice a week, and she missed it. So she came back to our friend's place and asked if we could walk her to a nearby highway to try and hitch a ride. The main road was about 7 miles away, so we started walking. When we got there, it was midweek and no cars had passed at all. I guess most people were still at work in this city, and as it got later, we decided to just walk back in the end. On the way back, we passed through a few neighboring villages that were half abandoned. Honestly, it was a little bit creepy, but we kept ourselves entertained by singing and joking around to keep the fear at bay, I guess. It was getting dark though, and we still had about 4 miles left. Then we ended up on this road with dense forest on both sides. And suddenly, we started hearing noises coming from the trees. It was pitch dark and honestly pretty unsettling, so we tried to joke about it, but deep down we all felt something was a bit off. Then my friend pointed and we saw 2 huge yellow eyes staring at us from the trees. We just kept walking in silence for a bit until one of us nervously said, "Must be some wild fireflies messing with us or something, right?" We laughed, but we all knew that those definitely were not fireflies. Keep in mind too that this was before cell phones, so no way to call anyone. We just had to keep moving and get back safely. As we got closer to the village, 2 of us heard a female voice coming from the forest suddenly. We looked at each other, both realizing that we had heard it, while the third friend was talking and didn't notice. I instantly got goosebumps because it sounded real, and the fact that I wasn't the only one who had heard it made it even more creepier. We didn't say anything until we got back to the house, but here's where it gets even weirder. So, in Slavic folklore, there's not just the Leshy, the forest spirit who protects the woods and sometimes plays tricks on people, but also the Rusalka. Rusalki are these mythological female spirits often connected to lakes and rivers. They're usually described as beautiful women with long hair, sometimes said to lure people, especially at night, with their singing or their voices. We've been hanging out at this lake for so many nights, and then to hear mysterious female voices coming from the trees later on, near this said lake, it definitely made us wonder if we had gotten a little bit too close to something supernatural. We still joke about those unhinged fireflies, but deep down we all know that we saw and heard something that we really cannot explain. Between the abandoned houses, the glowing eyes in the forest, and that eerie female voice, it was honestly one of the scariest and strangest experiences that I've ever had. And yes, I still think about those nights at the lake and wonder what might have been watching or listening to us out there in the darkness. I've been working as a food delivery driver for about 8 months now, and with how my contract works, I need at least 3 evening shifts, with 2 of those being between Friday and Sunday. I don't really mind working in the evenings since it has a nice vibe to it, being really calm, just throw on some headphones and a good playlist or a podcast and, well, you're good. Plus, I never really work for more than 4.5 hours on end since I work on an e-bike, so I don't do longer shifts without my battery dying, keeping in mind the bike needs to be taken home as well. Apart from some stupid encounters that I've had with teenagers trying to be funny in front of their friends, like barking after me and asking for food or pretending to be the customer, I've never really had anything creepy happen to me. It was until a few weeks ago. So, it was a Thursday evening and I had a shift from 5:30 till 9:30. Where I live, us delivery drivers get paid per hour instead of per delivery. This does have its advantages and disadvantages. One of the disadvantages being that we can't decline orders on our own end. If we, for whatever reason, cannot take an order, we need to talk with the company that we work for. So whatever trip is thrown at us, we pretty much have to take it. Up until this point, I've been having a good day, close by deliveries from nice local restaurants. None of the journeys were too far away places, which was good. The weather was fine as well, although a little bit chilly, but if you layer yourself well enough, then it's not as bad as long as it doesn't rain, I suppose, which luckily it wasn't. It was around 8:15 when I got a McDonald's order. The customer lived around 12 minutes away from the restaurant, which wasn't ideal, but it was fine since I had only lost one strap of battery so far. The location it was going to was also a good one, since the only time that I need to get off the bike lane was to cross some roads. Other than that, it was all bike lanes pretty much the whole way. So I picked up the order after waiting for around 15 minutes. I got onto my bike, chose a playlist, and made my way over to this customer. The streets were pretty quiet, setting the vibe. As I got closer to the customer's house, I made my way onto the sidewalk and cycled slowly, trying to find the house number, which can be a bit of a pain at night. I eventually did though, and I locked my bike up. I walked over to the door and knocked. After a few seconds, I heard commotion and I placed my bag down, taking out the food. The door opened and a lady greeted me with a smile. After handing her the food and telling her to enjoy, she thanked me, and after giving me a tip, she closed the door back up and I got back onto my bike and unlocked it. I had been charging my phone with my power bank, but wanted to take the charger off since my phone was now full enough. And dealing with a wire sticking out of my jacket pocket can be a bit of a hassle when taking off and putting back on my backpack. However, I always feel a bit awkward and watched staying in the front yard of people for too long, especially when they have those doorbell cameras, so I made my way over to a small alleyway close to the house. As I turned back off my bike, I took my power bank to turn it off, and then I changed my playlist, and as I was putting the power bank back into my pocket, I heard slow footsteps creeping closer to me from behind. Now, this alleyway that I was standing in was pretty narrow and small, so I was probably blocking it. I quickly moved and got off my bike, holding it close to me as I pressed myself onto the wall. I excused myself and made a gesture for the person to pass. But instead of thanking me and walking on, the person just sort of kept standing there. This is when I looked up. I was met with a tall, skinny lady standing just a few inches away now. Her face was slim and her long hair came to rest on her shoulders. Her face looked white and honestly, she looked like a heroin addict or something. She looked me dead in the eyes without any expression and was breathing through her mouth. She was wearing brown jeans and a blue hoodie with the hoodie on. Can I help you?" I asked after painful moments of silence. She looked at me for a few seconds and said, "You have my food." I froze. Now, in our app system, there is no way to actually confirm that the customer was the right one since we don't have any security codes to ask. Since I was busy with my power bank, I hadn't clicked finish order yet. I checked my phone and decided to ask the lady questions about the order. I think another driver might have your food. I just delivered to somebody else," I said with a smile. "Where did you order from?" If she was right, I would have been able to easily help her get a refund. However, she just sort of stared at me, her expressionless face turning into a hard, ugly glare. "No," she said loudly, "that was my food," she stated. Again, I tried to reason with her, asking her for her name and what food she had ordered. "I'm just trying to help you, ma'am. Check your app. The app should tell you how far the driver is." To this, she stepped back and pointed her hand at me. "My food. I need my food." At this point, I figured that she must be homeless and hungry or something. "I have some food if you want it," I said. Now, I always keep snacks on me in case I have to wait long for an order to get ready or have no orders to come in for a bit. We do wait a lot since we cannot turn down orders for taking too long to be made. My go-to work snacks are protein granola bars. They're easy to keep since they don't take up much space and you can eat them fast. I decided to give her a box and maybe she would be satisfied. I took one out of my backpack and I handed it to her. She took it from me, damn near snatching it out of my grip, and stepped closer. "I want my food," she stated sternly, her glare sharp. I let out a breath, getting really creeped out now, and once again asked her to check her app or give me her name, the name that she put up with her so-called order. She took a big breath, and before I could say anything, she exhaled and screamed bloody murder, making me flinch and press myself onto the wall. In the process, I accidentally moved my bike's throttle. This thing alone doesn't get past around 4 kilometers per hour. I had some struggle, but eventually got on the bike and pedaled away, and the lady still screaming behind me. I got to a fence that prevented cars from coming in and had to slow down a bit. And this was enough time for the lady to catch up and even grab onto the back of my bike. I let out a yelp as I could feel her try to push me back. I also heard something scrape the wall next to me. I didn't want to look and instead put my bike into a higher assist mode, which I normally never do and always keep on 2 to 3 to spare battery life, pedaling like my life depended on it as I got past the fences. I then put it even higher and finally I cycled away. I could hear the lady yelling and calling me a food thief and all this, and as I glanced back, she held the box of granola bars above her head and threw them at me. They landed about a meter away from me. I also noticed what was causing that scraping noise, as she was holding a knife in her hand. I focused back on the road and cycled away, hearing the lady still screaming, yelling, and trying to run after me. Eventually, I went back to the app and finally was able to click finish order, hoping to get a new one since I didn't want to aimlessly cycle around in fear of running into her since I thought that she might know all the shortcuts. I got a new order from a kebab place nearby, around 8 minutes away. This place was one that I got sent to a lot and the owner was very friendly, always asking us drivers if we wanted something to eat or to drink and saying that it was on the house. I got there and was slightly out of breath, and he asked me instantly what had happened and gave me some water to drink and helped me calm down a bit, and then gave me some food. After I told him, he talked to the company, saying that I was in no state to keep doing deliveries that night. My work agreed to allow me to end my shift earlier than normal. One of my co-workers came for the pickup, and since this delivery was just outside of city center, I biked back with him to the city center where it was still busy, and just went on home after that. I'm very glad for the timing of that order, to be honest, my co-worker and for the owner of the kebab store, and I really don't like to think about what that lady would have done if she had successfully pulled me off of my bike that night. My uncle and his family had multiple generations grow up in the same house. It was a beautiful 3-story Queen Anne Victorian home built in the 1890s by his great-grandfather. His family owned it up until about the 70s. It has changed hands outside of the family until about the 90s, after my uncle was able to purchase it, after establishing his own successful architectural firm. Multiple people in his family from earlier generations died in that house in the early 1900s, some from natural causes, a couple from diseases, scarlet fever and typhoid. But as soon as my uncle moved in, strange things started happening. Cabinets in the kitchen would be open when nobody was home, phantom footsteps were heard, and the weirdest thing, knocks on the door in the middle of the night and no one would be there. One of these instances of knocking on the front door to no one being there, my uncle got a call the next morning from his dad saying that his great-uncle, who had lived in the house as a kid, had actually died the night before, around the same time as the knock was heard. My own experience in the house was when I was in my late teen years. My uncle's family was out of town and they asked if I could sit the dogs for them. I always looked forward to it because the house was huge and they had a massive pool in the backyard to enjoy. but I also sort of secretly dreaded it too because the house was just really damn creepy at night. Old furniture, old family pictures, old light fixtures, straight out of a haunted house movie really. Well, one night when I was getting ready to go to bed on the second floor, the dogs suddenly perked up, which was strange to me. They all came into the same room that I was in and sat, staring out into the hallway on alert. Shortly after, I heard the sound of distinct footsteps coming down the hallway of the third floor above, and then footsteps down the stairs to my floor. I was frozen in fear suddenly. The footsteps stopped about halfway down the stairs, and not another sound was heard for the rest of the night. But I didn't sleep a wink that night. The last part of this story happened a few years ago, though, after they moved out of the house to downsize. The new owner called my uncle a month after moving in. After some cordial conversation, the new owner asked my uncle, "This might be weird, but did you have anything strange happen to you in the house?" My uncle responded, "Well, yes, when we first moved in, but what exactly do you mean?" The new owner explained that he was having some work done on the third floor and he hired some painters to repaint some of the walls. The new owner left the house to run a quick errand and came back to all the painters sitting outside on the front porch looking concerned. When the new owner asked what was going on, one of the painters said, "Mister, we are not going back in there. There's something on the third floor and we cannot figure it out." The painter elaborated that one of his workers was by himself on the third floor, and he felt a distinct touch of a hand on his shoulder. When he turned around expecting one of his painting buddies to be there, no one was there. The third thing that happened to the new owner too was that his brother came to stay the night one night. He was set up on the third floor, and when the new owner woke up the next morning, he found his brother asleep on the couch on the first floor. He asked his brother why he had changed rooms like this, and his brother had said that, "You're not going to believe this, but when I was getting ready for bed, I was putting away some clothes, and it felt like someone touched my shoulder, but when I turned around, nobody was there." My uncle responded to those stories saying, "Oh yeah, don't worry, those are just my old family members welcoming you to the home. They'll get used to you after a while." I'm not so sure that that was reassuring for the new owner or not, but in any case, that place is probably now haunted by my own family, and that's weird to think about. I want to start this by stating that before I moved to Oregon, or this house, I did not truly believe in the paranormal. I just thought of ghost stories as like entertainment really, but now I am a firm believer. In 2018, I moved into Central Oregon. I moved into the attic of a house that was built around 1840. I was a broke college student, and it was a great deal on rent. The other girls who lived in the house warned me, though, that strange things happened, but I just brushed it off, really. In the beginning, it was just small things, like the second-story balcony door being wide open in the mornings, but still deadbolt locked. Chairs from the first floor appearing on the second floor. Honestly, I just thought that it was my roommates messing with each other. Then comes Thanksgiving. So I'm the only one of 12 roommates to stay home for the holiday. I woke up and the house was freezing, so I sort of padded downstairs to turn up the thermostat. As I'm pressing the buttons, I suddenly hear two women talking. I stop pressing the buttons to listen to see who's home, and I hear one say he's coming, and I sort of immediately forgot everything else that they said. I wandered around the house though, trying to find who's home, but there was no one. It was just me. I spent the rest of the day trying to shake it off. I mean, it must have been from how exhausted I was. That night, I'm sitting on the couch in the living room with my roommate's kitten on my lap, petting her, and all of a sudden she goes sort of rigid in my lap. And I look up and I see a shadow on the window. Inky black like it was there on the glass and not a reflection or someone outside. I stare at it for a moment and feel it looking back at me. Then it moves across the glass and disappears. I call my only friend who was still in town and she comes over. After this, stranger things started happening too. Like when I would go into the basement, I would always feel eyes on me. One night, my roommate sees a man in what we call the catacombs. It's a sort of weird zigzagging hallway that leads from the main basement to the basement apartment. She calls the police, but they could not find anyone. In the attic, my bed is in a sort of triangle-shaped room, and at night it always sounds like someone's dragging their fingernails down it above my head. Things go missing in the house. All the fish in my roommate's fish tank suddenly die one night. I hear whispers all over the house, unable to pick up what they're saying or where they're coming from exactly. One day my roommates went out of a room through a window that doesn't lock, and they could not get back inside as the window was like suddenly stuck. They were trapped out there for hours until I came home and heard them yelling. The weird thing though is that I opened it easily and couldn't understand how they were stuck like that. Well, once the lease ended, we all decided to move out. I swore to never go back, but I often feel drawn to that house for some weird reason. If I'm out walking, I'll stand outside of it and I'll sort of just stare into the window of what used to be my room. Last night I was home alone, and before anyone says anything, yes, the police were contacted and investigated and all of that. So, like I said, I was home alone last night. My parents were out at an event with some friends, so I had to stay home and watch the house. Not long after they left, I drove to a Subway to just grab some food before heading home. To be honest, I'm not an easily scared person or anything like that, but I don't know, I get such an off, empty feeling when I'm home alone because I never feel like I'm quite alone, I guess. Anyway, after eating my food, I watched some TV in the living room for a bit, but then I heard sounds from upstairs. They sounded like light footsteps, kind of. I paused the TV and listened for a bit. The footsteps stopped. Not to sound too corny or full of myself, but I'm a little bit built and won't go down without a fight, so I gathered my courage to head upstairs, but of course with a knife, because I'm not dumb enough to leave myself open like that. I checked the whole upstairs and no one was there. And yes, I checked all the closets, under the beds, and everywhere someone could be hiding, and there was no one. I let out a small exhale of relief because if I did end up finding someone, then I really wasn't ready for what that would have looked like. It was getting pretty late anyway, so I switched the living room TV off, locked the house up all right, and made sure nothing was unlocked, including all of the windows, and then went to my room and watched some TV there. Everything was fine too until I heard light knocking. I looked around to see where it would be coming from, but my bedroom door was open and my closet door is built in a certain way that no one could possibly fit in there since it has like shelves, not an open space. I examined the house again and still nothing. Honestly, I was getting a little bit annoyed now. I went back into my room, but then heard someone calling me. It sounded so much like my dad's voice, and I sort of knew that it was because my dad has a thick Italian accent with a deep tone, so it definitely sounded exactly like him, but it was so weird because I didn't hear my parents come home. I was about to check it out too before realizing that every time that he called my name, it sounded exactly the same, almost like his voice had been recorded or something and just played over and over again. My heart absolutely sunk when I realized what presence that I was in. I quickly shut my door, and since it doesn't have a lock, I blocked it with my unit. I called my parents and they contacted the police. Police showed up about 10 minutes later from the station not being far from my house. I checked out of my window to make sure it was actually the police before heading downstairs and opening the door. I reported everything to them, and they told me that they would patrol the area after searching my house top to bottom, and no one was found. There was no break-in in the end because nothing was stolen. No doors or windows were unlocked or broken or anything, and apparently it wasn't a person. Which leaves me thinking that it was a mimic. In fact, I know it was. I've heard plenty of stories and seen dozens of clips of mimics being caught on camera. I didn't sleep last night, even after my parents came home. I was just so on edge because I know if I left my room from fully believing that it was my dad that I probably wouldn't be here anymore. This happened about 2 to 3 months ago. So I have a backyard area behind my house. It's actually just cement driveway with bushes, trees, and such off to the sides, really. But sometimes I take my dogs out there for a quick pee if a long walk is not due. So I'm out there with one of my dogs, probably at around 11 p.m. or 12 a.m., and he's sniffing around and peeing a bit, when all of a sudden I hear it. A voice, loud as heck. Almost sounds like he has a microphone speaker or something, and it's projected directly towards me. And for the next 25 seconds, this thing is absolutely yelling something at me. I don't know what he or it said. It was for sure not in English. I don't think it was Latin, and to be perfectly honest, it didn't sound like any language that I'd ever heard. But it was for sure a language. It spoke really loud and so distinctly that it was definitely an intelligent being. Now, for the first couple of seconds, my brain was overloading thinking, what the heck? Then I immediately think to record the sound. I didn't see anything, but I remember that I felt like my phone was inside because it was almost zero battery, and the next thought that I have is, this must be some sort of a prank or speakers or something. I mean, there is a building next door, but it's literally a retirement home, and in 20 years of living here, I've never heard anything, not even a TV playing from any of their windows, let alone something as loud as this. And then this happened. The voice sounded like it was coming from a 12-foot to 500-pound creature. That's how loud and strong it sounded. But nothing was there that you could see. And the moment that I thought that it must be speakers in some movie scene or something, I kid you not, the source of the sound went back and forth like the entire length of their yard. It was moving, back and forth, still talking to me, just maybe 10 feet away, way closer than the building itself. I concluded then that it was not a speaker, at least not from that building. The other crazy thing is that my dog was barking like crazy from where this voice was coming from. My dog never barks at hardly anything, especially in that scenario, with just us two sort of chilling outside like that. Honestly, I cannot stop thinking of what it was. I think it was alien or something of that sort. A friend that I told who believes me thinks that it was demonic, but either way, as scary as it was in that moment, I also think, wow, that was really interesting and sort of cool. After the fact, of course. The thing's voice sounded malicious though, for sure. And if real, it's probably something that could have crushed me like we can crush an insect. So that fact really does not give me any sort of peace. This happened back in August of 2014 while I was dealing with a rough transition in my life. This happened in the middle of the night, but I'm going to tell the whole story of that whole day so that you can get a better understanding as to why it's all just so crazy, as if seeing an evil entity isn't crazy enough, right? Anyway, that day in August of 2014, I had been 4 months into a recovery program healing from an addiction that I am still free of to this day. During my time at the program, I got warnings for talking during work. During the day, we worked in a warehouse that distributed donations to a big chain thrift store. During my shift that day, I got caught talking to a male resident, which was a huge no-no at this program. So because I got in trouble for the 3rd or 4th time, I unfortunately got kicked out of the program. I opened the back door and out I went. No cell phone or money. We pretty much worked for snacks at that time. I went into a liquor store and asked to use the phone, where I made plans to have my stepdad pick me up from the train station that day. I waited there for about 4 hours since I had to wait until he was done with what he had already planned, giving me plenty of time to think on my life decisions and really what I should do next. He finally arrived though, unhappy with me as expected. I sat in what would be my new room for the next couple of months feeling defeated and honestly just exhausted. It finally came time though to get some rest and I fell asleep pretty quickly. I started to dream that I was in a place that I loved as a child called Color Me Mine, but it was also a coffee shop of sorts. I sat at a table with no coffee or clay to paint, just sitting there, noticing that it was only me and a middle-aged woman who was working there. She was sweeping the floor and suddenly stopped and said, "So, Sarah, what are you going to do now that you got kicked out of treatment?" Even though this was a dream, I remember feeling shocked that she knew my name and such personal information. As I was thinking about how to answer her question, there was suddenly a deafening scream. The scream wasn't of terror though, it was of pure anger. The woman was just looking at me with no expression on her face while this scream was happening around us. It terrified me so badly, in fact, that I ended up waking up, but the weirdest thing is that I was still hearing this scream. It faded out and I was waiting for one of my parents to come to my room and ask what the heck that was about, but they never did. And just as quickly as the scream faded, I suddenly felt a presence to the left of my bed. That was when I noticed, standing there in front of the window, there was this entity. It looked like an angry, sickly, and demonic old woman. She was staring daggers at me and her mouth was open as if she were snarling. I was definitely awake at this point, and to this day I still know that I was awake. I looked right back at her and started praying. Since I had come out of a Christian-based program, it was honestly all that I could think to do at the time. Then she slowly faded away, and as she was, her expression softened, but was still full of hatred. Then she was gone. I sat there looking around my room. I'm not sure why, but I didn't feel scared after that. I laid back down and just went back to sleep. The next morning, I was making coffee with my mum and telling her about what I had experienced. She tried to tell me that it was all just a dream, even though I thought that I was awake after sitting up from hearing that scream that I'll never forget. She was sure, though, that the whole thing was a dream, not just the part up until the scream woke me up. But I know that at that moment that I sat up, still hearing that scream, that I was wide awake. I heard that scream still happening when I sat right up before I saw that evil thing as well. It's been over 10 years now, and I have never and will never forget it. Sometimes I think that that entity was angry because I was still determined to fight and better my life or something. I felt like the anger and the hatred that it gave off was because it wanted me to give up and wanted me to suffer. But instead, I chose to fight. And now, I am living an amazing life. This happened only last night, so it is still very fresh in my mind. I've been a caretaker in Scotland of a ridiculously large church, sanctuary, and 3 townhouses for the past 4 years. My job is to look after the various offices and function rooms of the 3 townhouses, manse, and church. These buildings, they're 4 stories high and built in 1710. I also look after the church and the sanctuary that are attached to the townhouses. It's a very large building attached to the other large buildings, and overall it's pretty overwhelming. Anyway, I start my evenings in there at around 6:30. I often don't switch on all the lights and have never felt threatened or creeped out carrying out my duties. Last night, however, I felt like an intense feeling of impending doom. I don't know how to describe it better than that, but I told myself that I was being ridiculous and tried to push the feeling to the back of my mind. At about 8 o'clock, I was in one of the charity creches, which is actually a really nice part of the building. Not spooky at all, and I suddenly heard a man say my name. I had looked around, but I was the only one there, so I dismissed it. Later, I was walking through the bridge between the townhouses and the church and heard footsteps behind me. I looked and saw no one, but the hair stuck up on the back of my neck again, and I tried to dismiss it, a little more difficult this time. Walking out of the bridge and into the outer sanctuary, I looked into the glass partition to the inner sanctuary, and I swear to you that I saw someone. I got a fright and I went in to see who it was, but again, no one. Then I heard a door slam up in the upper gallery. We have a choir room off the upper gallery, so I headed on up, saw no one, and tried to open the choir room and found it to be locked. I've never known it to be locked. I opened it with the master key and saw nothing except a few chairs and books, but smelled a really bad smell, like bad breath or something. I quickly closed it up and locked it again. At this point, I was more than uneasy. My last port of call at 10:30 was the crypt. I headed down the spiral stair into the crypt, which runs the entire underbuild of the property, and also slightly under the main road outside. Hard to explain, but I cleaned up, and as I was moving down the corridor, I heard footsteps again. I looked around. No one. There's only one entrance and exit in the crypt, so I was certain that I was alone. I quickly put my stuff away, did my final security sweep of the building, and locked up for the night. I had never felt so relieved to get out of that building before, though. I normally love my job there, but quite honestly, I'm a bit apprehensive of having to go to work tonight.